Marked by an Assassin. Eternal Mate's Paranormal Romance Series, Book 8. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 17. Harbin gripped the edge of the black marble counter in front of him and stared at his reflection in the mirror, his face lit by the oil lamps that burned at a low setting on either side of it. Bright silver eyes looked back at him, shining and intense. He breathed hard, trying to quell the buzzing in his veins, the fierce demand that told him to return to Aya and finish what they had started. His primal instincts commanded him to satisfy the need he had felt go through her with her climax. The need to feel his fangs in the nape of her neck, marking her as his forever. He growled and yanked the tap on, not waiting for the murky water to clear before scooping it up and splashing it on his face. The first wave drawn up from the well beneath the guild was warm, but it cooled quickly after that, until it was frigid and helped douse the powerful urge to surrender to that need and bite her. He shouldn't have let her carry him away like that, stripping down his resolve and his defenses, until he had given in to the hunger to have her. He should have been stronger. He should have resisted. Now he feared the buzzing in his veins would never go away, that he would forever be compelled to find Aya and be close to her, would forever need another taste of her, craving it until he went mad from that unfulfilled yearning. They didn't belong together. They were separated not only by the worlds they walked in, the realms they called home, but by a million other things, all of which he didn't even want to attempt to overcome, because it felt inevitable that there would always be one thing standing between them. His past. But gods, she had felt good in his arms, amazing wrapped around him and moaning hotly in his ear, uttering his name in a passion-drenched voice that was his new addiction. Forget the hunger to spill blood and the craving for the quiet calm that came before the kill. Aya was more potent than that, more addictive, and he wasn't sure he could ever get enough of her. Harbin shoved his hand through his damp hair, preening it back from his face, and looked up at himself in the mirror. His eyes caught on the red streaks on his bare torso, wrapping around from his back to his stomach just above his hips. He stroked the ones on his right with his fingers, his heart beating harder as he recalled how she had scored him with her nails at the height of passion, a lost and wild thing that had driven him into the same dangerous state, making him let go of the fragile tethers of his control and unleashing his more animalistic side. A growl rumbled through him. She had marked him with her claws, and fuck did he love it. He loved that she had sought to place a claim on him, marking him as hers. Too dangerous. He should have stopped her. He should have been stronger. He pinned his eyes back on his face in the mirror, and then slid them towards the door behind him, feeling the full weight of his situation bearing down on him as he stared at it. Now she was waiting in the other room, and he was locked in a cramped bathroom, and he would bet his left nut that she was just as confused as he was, searching for answers and not finding any. The door grew hazy, his focus failing as the buzzing in his veins grew louder, rolling into a deafening roar that had him on the verge of turning around, opening the barrier between them and sweeping her up into his arms for round two. He clamped his hands over the edges of the counter to anchor himself in place and breathed through it, using every technique he had learned over the past 20 years to master his emotions when they slipped the leash and maintain control. Calm battled against craving, a fight so fierce he wasn't sure he would win, and be able to subdue the urges running rampant through his blood, through his soul. Fuck, he could still sense her, could still feel the need in her. It was there beneath the surface when he went looking for it, easy to detect in her together with confusion, fear, and anger. It lingered as if she couldn't quite dispel it. Need, hunger, a craving that had his hands shaking against the marble, his fingers gripping it so tightly that his knuckles burned white. His primal instincts pushed him to return to her, the powerful urge born of the need he felt burning through her and the one it had triggered in him, a need to satisfy his female. He tensed when he sensed her move, his head twitching to his left towards the door. It didn't have a lock. He wasn't sure what he would do if she walked in. Wasn't sure if he would be able to control himself. He needed more time to rein in his desires and master them again, composing himself so he could face her. Fuck. There wasn't much in this world that scared him, but the beautiful female in the next room was doing a damned good job of rattling him. A knock sounded. Not on the bathroom door. Someone was at the main door of his small apartment. Someone powerful. He whipped around to face the bathroom door, and his eyes widened as he heard the quiet creak of the knob on the main door turning. Aya. He couldn't hold back the snarl as he yanked the bathroom door open and stormed into the bedroom, driven to place himself between her and the intruder. She stood in the narrow corridor between the bathroom and the bed, barely a meter from the opening door, hastily tying the belt of the blue robe around her waist. He grabbed her arm and shoved her behind him, shielding her with his body just as the door opened. Fury pinned cold black eyes on him, and then lowered them to his hand where it still gripped Aya's arm, holding her behind him. The elf's eyes narrowed, his nostrils flared, and his ears grew pointier. Aggression. Harbin knew the tells. He had been around elves long enough to have figured out the warning signs he needed to heed in order to keep his head on his shoulders. He had also been around the mad bastard in front of him long enough to know how to diffuse that aggression in most situations. "What do you want, Fury?" he said, pulling the elf's attention away from the female behind him and narrowing it down to him. Fury raised his gaze back to Harbin and relaxed a notch, but not as much as Harbin had expected. Something about Aya had rattled the elf, too. Because she was female? They didn't have a female in the guild, and the times he had asked Hart why, the elf had always glossed over it, mixing up his reasons between the female body's lack of natural strength compared with a male's, safety reasons, and keeping his male assassins on track at all times. Harbin was beginning to think it actually had something to do with Fury. The dark elf drew in a slow, deep breath and exhaled. Hart. Fury had never been a man of many words. In all the years that Harbin had worked for Hart, he had probably heard Fury speak around 100 words in English. He had heard the elf rant like a crazed son of a bitch in his own language, though. "I'll go to see him." Harbin tugged Aya closer to his back when Fury glanced down at her hand and she bumped into him, her other hand coming to rest on his bare skin and sending 1,000 volts through him. Heat curled outwards from the place where she touched, slowly sweeping through him and reigniting his desire. Fury's black eyes narrowed. Dark lines traced over him, flickering and broken, and he cast a pained look at Harbin before storming away. Hart had also never mentioned why Fury couldn't teleport. Harbin had never seen him attempt it before, and he felt sorry for the guy now that he had witnessed how much losing that ability had clearly hurt him. If he had to hazard a guess, he would say it was the price he paid for the hold the darkness had on him. What other abilities would Fury lose as he sank into the black abyss? He had the impression that Hart meant the world to Fury, and so did this job, just as it meant a lot to him. The thought that he might not be able to fulfill his duties as an assassin didn't sit well with Harbin, and he had only been working with Hart for a couple of decades. Fury had been with Hart for centuries. He couldn't imagine how Fury felt as he stood on the precipice, in danger of losing the abilities that were vital to his work as an assassin, and that were a deeply rooted part of who he was. Did he feel he was losing himself? Did he feel he would lose Hart, too? Aya shifted position, pulling Harbin's focus away from the empty doorway to her, where she moved out to stand beside him. He looked down at her, meeting her steady gold-silver gaze, feeling cold and hollow inside as he considered that he did know how Fury felt after all. He knew how afraid the elf was as he stood on the brink of losing everything that was dear to him. Only Harbin wasn't sure whether he was thinking about losing the guild, his work and Hart, or whether he was thinking about losing Aya. Harbin turned away from her and walked to the black chest of drawers against the same wall as the door, at the foot of the bed. He pulled the middle drawer open, grabbed one of his clean black t-shirts and tossed it at Aya. She squeaked as she quickly caught it, stopping it from hitting her in the face. Put that on, he grumbled and shoved the drawer closed and opened the one below it. All of his jeans would be too large for her, but there was no damned way he was going to let her wander the corridors of the guild hall in his robe, or that godforsaken little slip of hers. He groaned, a slip that he had left in the main reception room. He viciously yanked a pair of dark gray sweats from the drawer and slammed it shut. He would pick up the infernal slip on his way through to Hart's office. It had better still be there, or he would be tracking down whoever had stolen it and teaching them a lesson they would never forget. When he turned to face Aya with the sweatpants, his breath left him in a rush, and his chest suddenly felt too tight. She stood before him in just his t-shirt, the robe discarded in a pool around her bare feet. Her hands shook as she tugged at the hem of the t-shirt, trying to get it to cover more of her shapely thighs. His mouth dried out. Her eyes darted up to him, a pretty blush staining her cheeks, and he averted his gaze, turning his face away from her, and held the pants out to her. Heat bloomed on his cheeks as she took them from him, tugging them free of his grip. Fuck. She wasn't the only one with shaking hands now. He kept his eyes pinned on the black stone floor, giving her time to cover herself, and hoped to the gods that she didn't notice that he was blushing like an idiot. He had been inside her just minutes ago, pinning her to the wall and taking her hard, and now he was blushing because he had seen her bare legs? What the hell was wrong with him? He blamed his hormones. They were playing with him, messing him up worse than ever now that being on the cusp of maturity had clashed with finding his female in Aya. She shuffled away from him and he breathed a sigh of relief as the soft click of the bathroom door closing reached his ears. Harbin twisted and flopped onto his back on the bed, his arms splayed out at his sides. He needed to get his head on straight and kick his heart back into line, but it seemed impossible when she was near him. He couldn't focus on his mission or what he was going to say to Hart. He could only focus on her where she moved around in his bathroom, making herself at home in his tiny quarters. He blew out his breath and then chuckled. He had never brought a woman home. He had never let them get close to him. He was breaking all his rules with Aya, and he had a terrible feeling he was going to pay dearly for it. She had torn down his defenses and shaken his world all over again, rocking it and leaving him reeling. His heart was on the line again, and this time he felt certain he was going to lose it. Gods, if he was honest with himself, he had wanted to lose it to her 40 years ago, and it had hurt him when he had thought she didn't want it. Now part of him suspected that she had desired to steal it from him. She still desired it. Only now things were different. He wasn't the innocent boy he had been then, wide-eyed and awed by the world. He had seen too much darkness and blood, had spilled too much of it to be a good man. He had no status, no standing, no pride. He had gone against everything he had been taught, and in doing so he had destroyed the boy he had once been, and built a dangerous man in his place. One too dark and twisted to be worthy of a female like Aya. The bathroom door opened and he looked across at her as she stepped out, rolling the waist of his sweatpants over so they fitted snug against her rounded hips. Gods, she was beautiful. Damp strands of her black hair hung forwards, her gold-silver eyes intent on her work, making her oblivious to him. Rose still colored her cheeks, and her lips were still swollen and dark from the ferocity of his kiss. He couldn't take his eyes off her, not even when she stilled and slowly lifted hers to meet his. Her blush deepened, and he wanted to stand, cross the room to her, and gather her into his arms and kiss her again. He wanted to hold her close and never let her go. He closed his eyes instead and inhaled deeply, pushing away the tempting thoughts, because they were nothing more than torture to him. He wanted what he couldn't have, and no good could come of that. "Ready," she whispered, her soft voice trembling. He lifted his feet up and flipped onto them, grabbed his t-shirt from the bed, and pulled it on as he headed for the main door. "Just stay close." He pulled the black door open and stepped out into the corridor, and was a few strides down it before he realized that Aya hadn't moved. He backtracked and peered into his room at her where she still stood between his bed and the bathroom. Her wide eyes shifted from the corridor to him, her fear hitting him in powerful waves that had him crossing the short strip of floor between them and taking hold of her hand. It shook in his, and he sighed. "You have nothing to fear, Aya," he husked, and resisted the temptation to brush his fingers across her cheek when she lifted her chin and looked up at him, her silvery eyebrows furrowing, and the fear he spoke of growing stronger in her rather than abating. "I would never let anything happen to you. You know that, don't you?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the hall before returning to him, and then nodded. "I know. It's just—" "I know. You don't have to say it. I didn't feel comfortable here when I first arrived either." He looked away from her when her eyes widened and wished he hadn't confessed that to her. She did a good enough job of tearing down the barriers around his softer feelings, without him helping by opening them up to her. He tugged her towards the door, a little harder than he should have, and she stumbled into him. "Hart is waiting, and he gets pissy if you make him wait." She nodded and closed the door behind them, and then did something that threatened to completely blast his barriers into smithereens. She looped her free hand around his arm and huddled close to him, her breasts pressing against his bare skin, jiggling beneath her t-shirt with each step she took. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus on the corridor and his surroundings as he led her through the guild building. It was a struggle until someone came into view, a young new recruit. His senses immediately sharpened, his instinct to protect Aya driving him to go on the defensive. He tightened his grip on her hand and stared the assassin in the eye, locking gazes with him and holding it until the male had passed. He tracked him with his senses then, monitoring him until he was far away enough that he no longer posed an immediate threat to Aya. He did the same with every male that crossed their paths, gaining a few odd looks from some of them. He didn't care that he was acting territorial. He wouldn't let anyone frighten Aya. He would protect her as he had promised. They reached the main reception room. It was mercifully empty for once. His focus jumped to her cream slip where it lay on the floor where he had left it. He diverted course, bent and scooped it up and held it out to Aya. "You lost something." Her cheeks blazed and she grabbed the satin slip, scrunched it into a ball and shoved it into her pocket. Harbin smiled, unable to contain it. She was even prettier when she blushed like that, and it made him want to say things that would keep that red stain on her cheeks. She edged her eyes up and he schooled his features, adopting a flat expression that would have hidden his thoughts from anyone but her. Her little smile said she had sensed his amusement and his desire. It was hard to hide anything when she was connected to him already, the depth of it allowing her to sense things in him. Such a powerful bond was vaunted among his kind, most of his species wishing it for themselves when they found their mates and cherished by those who were gifted it by fate. It was rare, though. Many believed it made things easier for fated mates who shared such a connection. From where he was standing, it made the whole damned thing more difficult, because it was making him fall for her. Chapter 18. It had been 3 days since the meeting in Hart's office, and while Harbin hadn't come out and told her straight how annoyed he was by the decision she had made, and the fact the elf had backed it, he was definitely showing her how much it had angered him. Harbin's right fist slammed into her cheek, sending her stumbling a few steps before landing hard on the padded floor of the gym. She lay sprawled out on the rubber mat on her front, breathing hard and fighting to quell the pain. Every inch of her ached, but she wasn't going to give up. He wanted to make her throw in the towel and go back on their plan, and she was determined to survive what he had termed training and go through with it. "You gonna lay there all day?" he bit out as she pressed her palms into the black rubber, drew down a deep breath and pushed up onto her knees. Aya looked back over her shoulder at him and couldn't miss the anger in his silver eyes. They glowed brightly, shining like liquid metal under sunlight. He paced the mat, radiating tension at a level that had her wary of him. He had grown increasingly aggressive over the past few days, and she knew why. He was worried about her. This was his way of dealing with it, and she had to admit it wasn't a very good one. After the shouting match he'd had with Hart about the plan the elf had put on the table, and the furious way he had looked at her when she had agreed to play bait, she had tried to talk to him about it. He only responded in one of two ways each time she attempted to discuss things with him. He either gruffly stated that he would protect her, or he said it was her funeral. Not entirely the most helpful of responses. His mood had been mercurial, swinging between those two feelings, but one thing had remained constant: his desire to train her. Gods, he was pushing her hard, and he knew it. The bastard probably savored it, thinking she would give up if he kept shoving her harder and harder, hitting her with everything he had and not holding back. Well, she had news for him. She couldn't give up. No matter how much she wanted to collapse on the smelly rubber floor and sleep until her aching body healed. She couldn't give up because she wanted vengeance too, hungered for it now that she knew the truth, and knew that the one responsible was within her reach. If she could play her role and lure the Archangel Huntress out of hiding, then both of them could turn the page on a chapter of their lives that had been a nightmare. They could begin a new life. Aya sat back on her knees and looked up at Harbin as he stopped before her, a towering mountain of muscle and menace, his eyes flashing dangerously. He was angry with her and Hart, but she could feel other emotions in him. She could sense the underlying tension born of the realization that he was slowly closing in on the target that had eluded him for 2 decades, the one responsible for using him and killing so many of his pride. She could feel that he was eager to put the plan into motion, near desperate for her to reach a point in her training where they could set the trap for the Huntress, and that waiting was killing him. He wanted to rush to the final step. She could understand that. This moment had been 20 years in the making, and she felt the full weight of her part in the plan on her shoulders. He was relying on her to carry it out flawlessly. She would. She wouldn't fail him. He held his hand out to her, and she slipped hers into it. Warmth flowed down her arm from where they touched, heating her blood and making it burn for him. She stifled the need it birthed, a fierce hunger to have him touching her again, that had been steadily growing since they had made love. She had hoped the passionate moment they had shared would scratch her itch for him, allowing her to focus again, but it had only made things worse. The wicked, hungry look in his silver eyes said that she wasn't the only one aching for an encore. The second she was on her feet, he released her and backed off, placing a few meters between them. The room was huge, all of the equipment moved to the edges of the floor, but she still felt as if there wasn't enough space or enough air for her to breathe easily. Every morning she arrived here ahead of him from her assigned quarters nearby, dressed in the tight-fitting sports tank and sweatpants he had gotten her from the mortal world. Every morning she warmed up alone in the huge room. And every morning when he stalked into it, a grim look on his handsome face and his eyes instantly locking on hers, he sucked the air from the room and it closed in on her, feeling suddenly cramped and confining. That sensation only grew worse as they sparred, each blow he landed sending mixed signals through her body, making her angry that he had managed to strike her, but thrilled by the feel of his skin on hers. Gods, she was messed up. Fighting with him turned her on, and she hadn't failed to notice that it affected him too. He had stormed away from her enough times, slamming the door and leaving her alone for long minutes, before eventually returning and acting as if nothing had happened. And every time he returned, she ached for him to grab her and pin her to the wall, and take her as he had in his bedroom, wild and frantic with need, lost in his passion and desires. He never did. She had sworn what they had done would be a one-time thing, but she couldn't stop herself from wanting more from him. She didn't think this yearning for him would end until they went their separate ways. She wasn't sure it would end even then. Was she doomed to spend forever aching for Harbin? Aya exhaled hard. She had made her mind up about him, and she would stick with that decision, no matter how fiercely she desired him. She readied herself again, and he did the same, shifting his feet further apart and adopting a stance that she was familiar with now. She knew which direction he would attack from, and she would defend against it, just as he had trained her to do. He launched his left fist forwards, a lightning-fast strike that had caught her off guard the first few times they had fought. She blocked with her right arm, knocking his aside, and swung her left fist, aiming low. Her blow connected with his side below his ribs, tearing a grunt from his lips that she refused to feel bad about. He wasn't pulling his punches, so she refused to go easy on him in return. Harbin dropped his right hand and went to snare hers. She whipped it back, raised and aimed again, throwing her weight into the blow. He growled as it smashed into his cheek, snapping his head back, and then dropped into a low crouch. She always hated this bit. She cried out as his fist struck her in the stomach, sending pain splintering outwards, and recovered a second later, in time to grab his hair and shove his head down as she brought her knee up. It cracked into his face, and she released him as he fell backwards from the force of the blow, landing on his backside. He rolled backwards and pressed his hands into the floor above his shoulders. Every powerful muscle on his torso flexed, distracting her. She missed her cue as he flipped onto his feet and his fist smashed into her cheek, sending her crashing onto the mats. "For fuck's sake, Aya!" His bark was startling in the quiet room, the volume of it hurting her buzzing ears, as her body swiftly tried to heal the damage he had done, bringing her senses back online. "I've told you 1,000 fucking times. Sidestep, elbow to my face. I'll block it, and you can kick out my ankle to knock me away." She flinched with each of the first few words, but rallied as he went on, her anger mounting as he bore down on her, fury flashing across his face. "I'm not an idiot," she snapped and found her feet, coming to face him. She planted her hands on her hips and glared at him. "I was distracted." He huffed and folded his arms across his chest, causing his biceps to flex and distract her all over again. Gods damn him. They could have made her mate ugly in every way, but no, they made him frickin' perfect. "If you're distracted in here, what the hell are you gonna be like when you're out there and your life is on the line? They have to buy the bullshit we're peddling, Aya." He stepped closer to her, until she had to tip her head back to keep her glare locked on his face, a face she wanted to smash her fist into right now. Maybe if she messed it up enough, she wouldn't feel so hopelessly attracted to him. "What the hell is there to be distracted by in here anyway? I've removed everything that could possibly make you lose focus." "Everything except you," she growled before she could consider the impact her words would have, and that she was blowing her defenses wide open, leaving herself too vulnerable for comfort. He stilled and stared at her, his anger leaving him in a visible rush. Aya spun on her heel and paced away from him, unable to bear the way he was looking at her as if she had just confessed that she loved him or some shit like that, and he hadn't had a clue she felt something for him. Liar. She might have knocked him with her words, but she wasn't the only one having concentration issues. She had taken him down a few times when he should have been ready for her move, too busy staring at her body to notice her fist flying at his face. "I'm not alone in this, Harbin." She turned to face him, breathing hard to curb her anger, and the pressing need to pretend she hadn't just opened a can of worms she had intended to firmly keep the lid on. She couldn't run away now. She had to keep marching forwards, full steam ahead, even when she wasn't sure what it was that she wanted. The past 3 days had thrown her feelings into disarray, leaving her unsure whether she was coming or going, whether she wanted to leave him or convince him that they could make this thing between them work, even though she couldn't give him any cubs to continue his bloodline as a good mate could. He didn't say anything, just stood there breathing hard, his chest heaving beneath his tight black t-shirt. Distracting. Why couldn't he have stayed the skinny rake he had been as a young male? Why had the gods allowed his body to fill out so deliciously? "I know you feel it too, Harbin," she whispered, and his eyes widened further, his heart sounding in her ears as it picked up pace. "We're mates." He turned on his heel and paced away from her, scrubbing a hand across the back of his neck. When he reached the other end of the room, he stopped and stood still for what felt like forever, remaining with his back to her. It didn't take much effort on her part to feel the turbulent emotions in him. Her animal side was so attuned to his now, that she could clearly sense them and the agitation and uncertainty they caused. The hurt. "I know." He spun to face her, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "But that doesn't mean I'm right for you, Aya. I can't give you what you need, what you deserve." Gods, it hurt to hear him say that, even when she felt the same way deep in her heart. She couldn't give him what he deserved. She couldn't give him a family to soothe the part of him that still hurt from losing his. "You don't have a clue what I need, and you don't get to decide what I deserve," she said, and ventured a step towards him, her animal side prowling just beneath her skin as she stared him down. "It's my choice." He had made himself a challenge, and heck, her primal nature appreciated that with a rumbling purr. It wanted to defeat him and bring him to his knees. It took all of her will to stop the shift from sweeping through her, carrying her away and making her surrender to that need to fight him and make him submit to her. Maybe this was a blessing in disguise, giving her the strength to sever ties with him once their mission was done. She had intended to leave him and not look back after all. So why did it hurt so much to hear him say he didn't want her as his mate? Why did the rejection sting like 1,000 hot needles piercing her heart? She had thought she had hardened that heart, but it was as soft and vulnerable as it had been 40 years ago, when he had broken it then. Her primal side stirred in response to her pain, twisting it into anger, and she bared her small fangs as she growled at him. He wanted to see her fight, always goading her into going all out to make their mock battle as realistic as possible, and so he could assess her abilities. Well, if he wanted a fight, she would damn well give him one. She would show him that she wasn't a delicate female in need of coddling, one who was too weak to walk in his world at his side. She would show him that she was strong enough to handle him. Aya kicked off, crossing the span of mat between them in a blur and slamming into him. She knocked him back, sending him off balance, and shoved her hand up, catching him under the jaw with the heel of her palm. His head snapped back, his growl rumbled through her, and then he was on her. She squeaked as he grabbed her arm and twisted with her, bringing her into a chokehold. The second she found her balance, she stomped on the inside of his ankle and whipped her left arm up, bringing her hand over her shoulder and cracking his nose with it. The metallic tang of blood flooded the thick air, bringing with it a momentary pang of guilt that she quickly suppressed. Aya brought her right arm down hard and elbowed him in the ribs. He grunted and lost his grip on her as he staggered backwards. She turned on him, sweeping her left leg upwards as she did so, aiming for his head. He growled and blocked her with his right hand. His fingers tightened over her ankle, and the world whirled past her as he pulled her towards him, bringing her leg under his left arm. He pinned it there, shoved her in the shoulder, and sent her crashing onto her back on the rubber mat, with him on top of her. Aya struggled, shoving at his chest and trying to move him. He braced his weight on his palms above her shoulders and pinned her legs with his, bringing their bodies into contact. She instantly stilled, her heart lodging in her throat as her body came alive in a hot rush of tingles. "Where was that fight when we were training?" he murmured, his warm breath washing her face, and canted his head to one side, his silver eyes shimmering with amusement. Amusement she didn't share. Couldn't. Not when his weight was pressing down on her in the most intoxicating way, making her think wicked things, filling her head with dangerous thoughts. His smile faded as he stared down into her eyes, his feelings shifting as if they had caught the current of hers, and he was being swept along in the moment with her now. His steady silver gaze fell to her lips. Her snow leopard side purred in anticipation, eager for her mate to take his prize for besting her. Her more human side warned that prize would be her heart, and he would crush it. Aya panicked. She pushed against his shoulders with all of her strength, shoving him off her, and scrambled onto her feet, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. He sat on the floor, staring up at her, a lost look on his face. "I need a break." She ran for the door and bolted down the corridor outside it, not slowing until she had reached the black door of her quarters near Harbin's. She hesitated and looked back along the hallway towards the gym, her heart steadying as she breathed slowly. The part of her that expected Harbin to be only a few steps behind her was disappointed, and she wasn't sure what to make of that. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. She had survived hell in the hands of Archangel, had been strong enough to withstand the torture they had inflicted on her for 3 years, but she wasn't sure she was strong enough to survive this. The more time she spent with Harbin, the deeper her need of him grew, and the weaker she felt. She needed him more than air in her lungs or food in her belly. She still had 2 more days until her return to the mortal world. She wasn't sure she could last that long. She wasn't sure she could last another second without another taste of Harbin. Chapter 19. Harbin slammed his fist into the black punching bag. It swung back violently, the chain rattling, before coming at him. He smashed his other fist into it, knocking it at an angle towards his right, and swiftly shifted around to his left, dropped his torso, and brought his right leg up. He growled as his shin connected with the heavy bag and carried through, putting all of his strength into the kick. The bag lurched, swinging upwards and almost touching the ceiling of the gym before coming back down. He didn't let up the assault. Whenever the bag came close to him, he attacked again, punching and kicking, each move fast and full of the fury blazing in his blood, anger stirred by the way he had handled Aya, stoked by the way she had walked away from him with a cold look in her eyes, one he had never seen before and never wanted to see again. She had looked at him as if he was a stranger, and it had left him frozen to his bones, shaken to his soul. He had foolishly opened up to her, allowing her close to him, and now she was distancing herself from him. Fuck. It was what he wanted, wasn't it? If this distance between them was truly what he desired, why did he feel so wretched? Why was he yearning for her, aching to feel her in his arms, to have her standing before him with warmth in her beautiful eyes? He smashed his left fist into the bag, his bones aching from the force of the blow, and snarled through his emerging fangs. He needed to get away from the guild, needed space so he could clear his head and think straight. That need was strong, but another was stronger. The need to remain near Aya. The thought of leaving her alone in the guild tore another growl from his lips, and had his snow leopard side pushing hard, commanding him to go to her and guard her door while she was vulnerable. Harbin caught the punching bag in both hands and breathed hard, fighting that urge as it grew stronger. Sweat rolled down his spine beneath his t-shirt, soaking the black material. He pushed one hand through the damp strands of his silver hair and exhaled slowly, seeking to steady his heart. It was impossible when everything in the room smelled like Aya, taunting him with her scent, keeping his need for her at a steady rolling boil. He wasn't right for her. No female like Aya deserved a fucked-up guy like him, but there was a part of him that just couldn't stay away from her, that only wanted her more because she had turned cold towards him, pushing him away. He needed to thaw the ice that had been in her eyes. He needed to thaw the block of it that filled his chest. He just needed her. She had snuck into his heart, and he had the feeling that she had already stolen it without him noticing, and now he couldn't function without her. She had become his heart. She had become his light in the darkness, his reason for moving forward through life. She had become his everything. That scared him. He still wasn't sure whether she could ever accept a male like him as her mate. She hadn't given him any indication that she wanted more from him than a tumble in the hay. Gods, it was a messed up situation. He had spent 40 years wanting nothing from females but a quick fuck with no strings attached, discarding them when they tried to get too close to him. Now he was the one who wanted to get close to someone, and they were the one pushing him away. Maybe he was getting what he deserved. Maybe. But he wouldn't know if he didn't fight for her, if he didn't put his heart on the line and do all he could to convince her that he could be what she needed. He had to try, because the thought of losing her hollowed out his chest and left him dead inside. Harbin strode across the room, yanked the door open, and stormed down the black corridor, heading towards her quarters. He picked up the pace as he walked, each stride quicker than the last, until he was jogging and then running through the building, his heart filled with a need to see his female. He needed to have her in his arms again. He needed her to look at him with that soft light in her eyes, the one that made him feel she could love him, that he was worthy of someone's affection, that he wasn't a lost cause, doomed to the darkness, that he could be saved, he could redeem himself. He skidded to a halt outside her room and braced his hands on the door frame, catching his breath as his thoughts kept running at 1,000,000 miles per hour, rushing through his head and making him dizzy. Aya was everything he needed. She was his redemption. Revenge wouldn't grant him the peace he had found with her, the strength to move forward and walk a lighter path with her at his side. He twisted the knob and pushed the door open, entering quietly and scanning the bedroom. Her clothes lay in a heap on the dark blue bed covers. His ears twitched as the sound of water running reached them, and he eased the door closed behind him. His gaze strained to the bathroom door. She was showering. Fuck. That had his body responding in an instant, mind conjuring an image of her that he couldn't shake. He palmed the growing bulge in his sweatpants, rubbing his hand down the length of it, and tried to stifle the sudden surge of desire. He had come here to talk to her, but his body had other ideas now, and every hard inch of him wanted to go along with them. He had seen the way she had looked at him, had sensed the depth of her desire back in the gym when she had been pinned beneath him, her soft body cushioning his. She had thought wicked things, and now he wanted to make those things a reality. His feet carried him towards the bathroom door, a slave to his desire, lost in the thought of having her again and satisfying her needs. He slipped silently into the room and watched her as she turned beneath the jet of hot water, his heart laboring and cock growing even harder, until it bordered on painful. She sang as she washed her hair, the damned steam from the water obscuring her body and stealing it from view. He wanted to see it again. He kicked off his boots but didn't bother removing the rest of his clothes, didn't even think about what he was doing as he slowly walked towards her. She turned back towards the water, raising her head and allowing it to stream over her face. Harbin's heart beat hard as he slid the double shower cubicle's door open and stepped onto the raised tray. Aya shrieked and turned to face him, spraying him with hot water. It bounced off her shoulders as she stared at him, wide-eyed, her shock rippling through him. "Harbin!" He pressed the fingers of his left hand to her lips and claimed her hip with his right one, shaking his head as he drew her closer to him. "Don't speak. I'm afraid that if you speak, I'll change my mind." He dropped his head and kissed her, and moaned as she responded, instantly opening for him, her tongue seeking his. He growled into her mouth as he angled his head and kissed her, pulling her up against him and pinning her there, keeping her close to him. She tiptoed and stroked his tongue with hers, tearing another groan from him as he imagined that tongue teasing him elsewhere. His cock throbbed in response, pressing against her belly, and she tensed. Her hands pressed against his chest, and he thought she would push him away and tell him to leave. But she bunched his t-shirt into her fists and kissed him harder instead. The water beat down on her back, spraying over him too, soaking his clothes. A growl rumbled up his throat when she tightened her grip on his t-shirt, and the sound of material tearing filled the heavy air. A thrill went through him when he felt her claws pressing into his bare flesh. Fuck, he needed to be naked with her. He needed to feel her nails scoring his flesh again as he satisfied her. He needed her to mark him as hers. He stepped back, released her, and yanked his t-shirt off. It slapped on the floor behind him, and Aya's little growl of appreciation almost did him in. He trembled as he forced himself to remain still, to absorb the sight of her standing before him, her hungry eyes tracking over his chest and downwards, lingering on each tensed muscle of his abdomen before drifting onwards to the waist of his sweatpants. She licked her lips. He snarled in response, his needs stoked to new dizzying heights by the desire rolling off her, hunger that he had stirred in her. He wanted to satisfy that hunger, pleasuring her until she couldn't take any more. He wanted her to keep looking at him like that, as if she couldn't get enough of him, might die if he didn't touch her or allow her to touch him. He ran his thumbs around the waist of his sweatpants, and her breathing came quicker, her heart pounding in his ears as her eyes followed his hands. Her sweet lips parted, her chest heaving as he slowly inched his pants down over his hips. Her pupils dilated as he revealed his rigid length, her breath stilling and eyes locking on it. The hunger that poured through him was potent and commanding, telling him to take her. She was ready. He could feel it in her. She wanted what she saw, and it was hard to deny her, to take things steady this time. He needed more from her than a quick dirty fuck in a shower. She needed more. He kicked his sweatpants off, shoved them behind with his foot, and ran his hand down the length of his cock. She growled, a possessive and hungry rumble that had his balls tightening in response, and pushed him to forget about taking things slowly. He breathed through it, finding his control again, and looked her over. God, she was incredible. His hungry gaze lingered on the flare of her hips and the roundness of her belly. She turned slightly, her hands coming up to cover her breasts, as if his scrutiny embarrassed her. Her body twisted at an angle, revealing the lush curve of her bottom and hiding the neat thatch of curls at the apex of her thighs. Hell, she was like Venus in that painting. All curves, all woman. A beauty. Her figure spoke to him on a primal level, one he had never been aware of before setting eyes on her. She was sexy as sin and alluring as a siren. He had always figured himself to be like so many other males, attracted to model-thin females, but he had never felt as drawn, as deeply attracted to anyone as he was to her. She was perfection. He couldn't keep his eyes off her curves, or his thoughts off placing his hands on them and claiming them as he drew her against him. The shy edge to her expression pulled words up from his heart, ones he couldn't hold back, because he knew she needed to hear them. You're beautiful, Aya. Never hide from me. You're beautiful. He stepped towards her and she uncurled slightly, lifting her chin and slowly dropping her hands away from her bare breasts. He exhaled slowly and reached for her, brushed his fingers across her wet cheek, and absorbed just how gorgeous she was. I always thought you were beautiful. She blushed, the heat of it warming his skin and his chest. His gaze roamed over her again, taking in that beauty. His primal side whispered to him, the voice coming from a part of him that he never knew existed, telling him that she would be a wonderful mother, a female who could only look more beautiful when she was pregnant with his cub. He had never considered family before, not in his line of business, and he had no place thinking about it now. No right to think of her as belonging to him. Even if they were to mate, he couldn't allow himself to think that she belonged to him, that she was nothing more than a possession or a trophy to do with as he pleased. He wasn't his father, and he would damn well make sure he never turned into that cold son of a bitch. If Aya gave herself to him, she would walk by his side. No, she would walk ahead of him and he would follow her, her loyal male and mate. He would place her on a pedestal, and he would love her forever. She was his everything. You're pretty gorgeous, too, she said, a tremble in her voice, and he realized his staring at her in silence, lost in his thoughts, had unsettled her. He smiled, stepped into her, and wrapped his arms around her waist, pinning her against him. She tipped her head back and looked up at him, a rosy hue still staining her cheeks. He wasn't sure he would ever get enough of her blushes. She rose on her toes, caught him around the back of his head with her right hand, and drew him down for a kiss that seared his blood and had him forgetting everything, even his own name. He groaned and gathered her closer, losing himself in her and the passion he could feel flowing through her, the hunger and need that called to him, the love and desire that purged the darkness from his soul and filled it with light. Her belly pressed against his hard length, wedging it between them, and her slick breast squashed against his chest, warm on his cooler skin. He ran his hands down the small of her back and over her bottom, and swallowed the gasp that left her as he dug his short claws into her peachy globes. Her kiss grew fiercer, her lips clashing with his and fighting him for dominance. The passionate battle stirred his primal side, rousing it and making him fight harder, eager to subdue her. She moaned and ran her claws over the back of his neck, and his eyes widened as an electric thrill ran down his back to his balls. He wanted more of that. He wanted to feel her marking him. He backed her into the black tiles beneath the shower spray, earning a husky groan as his reward as his body pinned hers. He released her backside and pressed his hands to the wet tiles, caging her between him and the wall. Or so he thought. Her lips left his, and he frowned and went to growl at her, reprimanding her for moving. But it came out as a feeble groan as she dropped to her knees, and her breath washed over his rigid shaft. The first sweep of her tongue up the hard length of him had his fingers tensing against the tiles, and the brush of her mouth over the blunt head had his arms trembling as he leaned harder against the wall for support. He hung his head and couldn't take his eyes off her as she took him into her mouth. Her golden-silver eyes, lifting to meet his, stole his breath away and heightened everything, until each sweep and press of her tongue was pure torture, and he wasn't sure he could last. His knees weakened and he groaned as she sucked him, hard and long, taking him deep into her mouth. Her tongue pressed into the underside of his cock each time she withdrew, sending a thrill shooting down to his balls as it flicked over the sensitive head. Harbin grunted and tried to hold back, but couldn't when she cupped his balls and rolled them in her palm. He gave tense, shallow thrusts, pumping into her hot mouth, lost in the pleasure flowing through him, bliss that was made all the more intense by the way she kept her eyes on him the entire time, watching him as he watched her sucking his cock. Gods, it was too much. He needed to taste her, too. He jerked his hips back, pulling free of her mouth, and grabbed her under his arms. He dropped to his knees and he forced her to stand, and had her right leg over his shoulder and his mouth on her before she could utter a syllable. She cried out as his tongue probed her fingers swiftly grasping his hair and tugging on it as desperation rushed through her, a need for release that called to him. Harbin groaned into her and licked her harder, stroking slowly from her entrance up to her aroused little nub. The tiny bead tensed beneath the touch of his tongue, eager for more that he willingly gave to her. He flicked his tongue around it, teasing and tearing moans from her, driving her wild as she clutched his head and pressed back into the tiles behind her. Her breath shuddered with each sweet groan of pleasure he elicited, her body tensing and relaxing, as if she wasn't sure what to do, was lost and unable to find her way. He was all too happy to direct her. He took her nub between his teeth and bit gently, and she tensed and cried out, her body rocking hard into his face. She tasted divine. He licked his way down to her entrance, hungry for more of her sweet taste. She moaned and rode his tongue as he swirled it around her core, probing it before withdrawing and teasing her again. "Harbin," she shook against him, trembling with need, on the precipice. He growled and shot to his feet. Her right leg caught over his arm as he clutched her backside and entered her with one swift thrust right to the hilt. Aya cried out again, the sound the sweetest thing he had ever heard, as her core quivered around his cock, throbbing and milking it as release took her. She breathed hard, little moans leaving her lips in time with each undulation of her body, her hands grasping his head and his shoulder, anchoring herself. Her silver eyebrows remained furrowed, her black hair hanging in slick ribbons against her pink cheeks, her mouth open and eyes screwed shut as she slowly came down from her high. He withdrew and plunged back into her, tearing a new moan from her lips as he easily slid into her, as deep as she could take him when she was slick with her climax. He rode each quiver of her body, thrusting with long, leisurely strokes of his cock, withdrawing right to the point of coming free of her body before pushing back in, making sure she felt every hard inch of him and knew what she did to him. The calm from her climax slowly faded as he moved inside her, the desire he could sense in her building again towards her next peak. He clutched her backside when she wrapped both of her legs around him and began to join in, rolling her hips and meeting his thrusts. He groaned and kissed her, claiming her mouth as his as he claimed her body, pumping her harder and driving her higher. Her moans teased his ears, each flex of her body against his, making his balls draw up and tighten, pushing him closer to his own release. He ground his teeth and tore himself away from her mouth, burying his face in her neck as he fought for control, mastering his body so she would find another release before his overcame him. He clutched her tighter and thrust harder, his control slipping as his primal hungers took command again, thundering in his blood and awakening his need to have her as his mate, to sink his teeth into the nape of her neck and mark her as forever his. Harbin bit down on his own lip to quell those hungers, satisfying them with the taste of his own blood on his tongue as he drove into her harder now, unable to hold back the ferocity of his need as it overwhelmed him. His balls grew tighter, his shaft thickening as he thrust into her. She moaned hotly in his ear, his name falling from her lips in a chant like a prayer, a plea for more. She was close. He growled into her throat, grasped her backside, and quickened his pace. Frantic, wild thrusts that had his body slamming against hers. Awareness grew at the back of his mind, a fear that he was hurting her with his roughness, his need to have her and release inside her, spilling his seed and marking her in a most primal way. He couldn't bring himself to heed it, and the way Aya was urging him on, her feet pressing into his backside each time he withdrew and forcing him back inside her, said he had nothing to fear anyway. She was as wild with need as he was, as lost in their passion. Her fingers tugged on his hair, yanking his head back, and he groaned into her mouth as it seized his. She moaned back at him, her tongue sweeping over his lips, over the points where his fangs had broken his skin. Her moan turned into a growl, and she kissed him harder, gripped him tighter, and did something that catapulted him over the edge. She bit him. Her small fangs sinking into his lower lip sent a shock wave through him that stole his breath, made his ears ring, and had white spots dancing across his vision. He slammed into her, hard enough to smash her against the tiles and knock the breath from her lungs, and shuddered as his cock throbbed, shooting hot jets of his seed into her. She quivered around him again, throbbing with her own release, a climax that rolled through him too, their pleasure mingling and heightening until he couldn't think. He could only feel. Pleasure, bliss, warmth, hunger, desire, lust, love. It all rolled through him like a wave and crashed over his heart. Aya stroked his shoulders, her body trembling against his as he held her in place, struggling to bring himself down and find his balance again. She swept her tongue over his lip and he moaned, shook as the hunger and need that never seemed quite satisfied where Aya was concerned began to bubble up again, simmering in his veins. He wasn't sure he would ever get enough of her. The more time he spent with her, the more he wanted her, the more he craved her. Now he craved her more than the quiet, emotionless calm that had once been the balm for his troubled soul. He wasn't sure what lay ahead of them, but he knew one thing with startling clarity. Neither of them could move on with their lives until their pasts had been laid to rest. If he was going to win Aya as his mate, he had to give her the vengeance they both needed. But to achieve that, he had to place her in danger. He had to risk losing her in order to win her. Chapter 20. Aya huddled into her thick gray wool coat, wrapping her arms across her chest and tucking her hands under her armpits as she hurried along the quiet street. The lamps were spaced far apart, allowing dark patches between the yellow pools of light. It had never bothered her before, but it set her on edge now. Truthfully, she had been on edge since Hart had teleported her back into her apartment, setting their plan in motion, and had announced that Harbin would return to the mortal world and would be tracking her, lying in wait to attack her. She hadn't slept well that day, or any day after it. She hadn't realized that playing bait would take longer than a day at most, hadn't considered that she would be constantly on alert, waiting for Harbin to launch his attack and trigger the second phase of the plan. It had been over 72 hours since Hart had dropped her off, and it was growing increasingly difficult to relax and act normal, going about her usual business. Harbin had to attack her out of the blue to make it look real. That really didn't help. Whenever she left her apartment, she was constantly on high alert, her senses scanning as far and wide around her as they could reach, monitoring everything for a sign of him. Whenever she caught his scent or felt him near to her, she grew tense, her body coiling in anticipation, and her snow leopard side pacing restlessly beneath the surface, itching for her to change and defend herself against the invisible threat. Now she was tired, both physically and emotionally exhausted. She had barely caught a few hours' sleep during the past 3 days, and being on alert all the time was draining her. If Harbin didn't attack her soon, she wasn't going to have the strength left to fight him and make it look convincing. She unfurled her arms and pushed her hood back, sucked down a deep breath of cool night air, and blew it out. It had to be soon. She didn't think she could take this uncertainty for much longer. Even with her training, she felt exposed and vulnerable. Her ears twitched, her senses sharpening when she felt someone watching her. Not Harbin. Aya kept walking, heading along the silent street and then banking right at an alley between 2 brick buildings. The shortcut would bring her out near the entrance of Switch. She had been walking the same route each night, going about her normal routine of heading to the club, chatting with Rocky, and then dancing for a few hours before heading home. She was glad that Rocky had returned to the club, and that Archangel hadn't had a chance to study him. He had escaped the compound before his scheduled time with the scientists. When she had braved a visit to the club on the first night of her return to the mortal world, he had greeted her with a hug so tight that she had almost cried. She had wanted to tell him that she was sorry, that it was her fault he had been caught, but she had been aware of the other people on the street and that any one of them might have been watching her and listening in on their conversation. When everything was over, she was going to sit the big guy down and tell him straight what had happened. She valued their friendship too much to lie to him, and in her heart she knew that he would forgive her. Maybe she would tell him tonight that she needed to speak with him in private, because it was eating away at her. A shadowy figure dropped right in front of her, and she staggered back a few steps, heart racing as she gathered her wits and quickly focused. Not quite quickly enough. She grunted as a fist connected with her jaw, and the male muttered a curse under his breath. Harbin. Dressed head to toe in black combat gear, he was a wraith in the darkness. His eyes caught the dim light, flashing silver at her, and her pulse accelerated as he advanced on her. She sucked down a deep breath and tried to quell the trembling in her body, preparing herself for his next move. The smell of him, spice and snow, awakened her body and mind, and triggered her training. She blocked his next attack and landed her own. He was faster than he had been in the gym, and she struggled to keep up with him and his moves, tripped over a few of the ones they had run through, allowing him to land more blows than she should have. She swiftly blocked the kick he aimed at her head, using both of her forearms to stop his shin, and then shoved against his leg. He lost balance and barely recovered, giving her an opportunity she couldn't waste. Aya spun on her heel and brought her own foot up in an arching kick. It connected hard with the side of his head and he staggered sideways, hit the wall and braced himself against it. He growled and shook his head, tossed her a black look that she could easily read. She was breaking with the fight they had planned together and it was pissing him off. But he really had caught her off guard and her instincts had seized control, her primal side rising in response to the danger he represented. She couldn't move as swiftly as he could, not when it came to fighting. She hadn't expected him to crank up the speed this much. It was impossible for her to keep up, so she was going to wing it. He launched at her and she flipped backwards, landed in a crouch and kicked off. She sailed through the air, effortlessly gliding over his head. He skidded, twisted, and pushed off again, running right at her. Her feet hit the tarmac and she sprang right, kicked off the wall, and landed behind him again. He snarled and turned on her, his frustration rolling off him in warning waves that she chose to ignore. She was a female shifter, more agile than the males of her kind. It was more realistic that she would use her speed to defend herself, rather than attack someone stronger than her. The second he neared her, she swept her leg up into another fierce kick. Her boot hit him hard on the jaw, snapped his head to his right, and sent him crashing to the ground. He pushed himself up on his hands and roared at her, his silver eyes flashing dangerously. Her primal side responded in an instant, rising to the threat he had issued and refusing to back down. Stupid male. If he wanted to fight, he would have one. She tore her coat off and was out of her boots before he had even found his feet. The shift was quick to come, her bones aching as they stretched or shrank, distorting to new forms beneath her skin. Fur rippled over her body, sweeping up her legs first as they shortened inside her jeans. She landed on all fours and growled as she kicked her trousers off, freeing herself, and then shuddered and mewled as the change reached her arms, the pain of the shift almost blinding her. She hated calling it quickly and was ridiculously out of practice. Harbin was faster than her, his shift complete well before her tail had finished growing from the base of her spine and her ears had rounded and moved up her head. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, seeing the majestic male he truly was staring back at her through bright silver eyes. He was larger than her in his cat form, a beautiful big male with thick lustrous silver fur dotted with dark crescents and spots. The sight of him in his animal form sent an unexpected response through her, a powerful urge that she struggled to deny. She wanted to rub against him, wanted to scent him and get his attention. She wanted him to rub her in response, to show her affection and attention, as a mated male would. Stupid instincts. He moved in a blur of silver, and she grunted as he landed on her, both huge front paws coming down hard on her shoulders. She growled and rose onto her back feet to dislodge him. He only tightened his hold on her and did something she really hadn't anticipated. He sank his fangs into the back of her neck, his hold strong but soft enough that he didn't break the skin. She whined and tried to break free, but he refused to release her. He bore down on her instead, using his heavier weight to send her down onto her paws. If she didn't break free, he would have her pinned on her stomach. She snarled and twisted her body, whimpering as pain tore through the back of her neck and the scent of blood bloomed in the cold air. Harbin released her and backed off, his shock rippling through her, surprised that she had hurt herself in order to escape him. It was what any cat shifter in her position would have done. It shouldn't have come as a shock to him when they were trying to make this fight look real. Her heart whispered that it hadn't been shock over the fact she had been willing to hurt herself. It had been surprise that she had allowed his fangs to penetrate her neck in the very place he needed to bite to mark her as a mate. She hadn't even considered that in the heat of the moment, but she felt sure that it took more than a little scratch to bind them as mates. Every lesson she'd had about mating, the teacher had said the male had to fully penetrate the female's neck with all four fangs. Harbin had barely scratched her. She used this momentary distraction against him and leaped at him, splaying her front legs as she sailed through the air. He reacted quickly, rising onto his hind legs to defend against her. His larger paws came at her as she landed just short of him, smashing against her shoulders and the side of her head. But she had won this round. Aya twisted her head as her front legs wrapped around his chest and bit down on the vulnerable underside of his neck, sinking her fangs into his throat and locking her jaw to stop him from shaking her. His heart pounded wildly in her ears as he went down with her on top of him and struggled against her, kicking his back legs and trying to catch her delicate stomach with his claws. She held on, refusing to release him. His movements grew weaker and then suddenly stopped, his body going slack beneath hers. He shifted back and his neck slipped free of her teeth, smaller in his human form. She backed off, her eyes darting over him as she breathed hard, senses locked on him and searching. Searching. Her heart hitched, pain pulsing through her as no heartbeat reached her sensitive ears. No. Aya shifted back, her t-shirt and deep blue jumper offering her little protection against the frigid night, not as her fur had. She shivered, but not from the cold. The ice in her veins was born of fear. Had she killed him? Tears formed in her eyes, hot and stinging, and she shook her head, her short black hair brushing her cheeks as she stared down at Harbin where he lay naked and motionless on the black ground, his throat covered in blood. No, she couldn't have killed him. He couldn't be dead. Her hands shook and she balled them into fists, trembling all over as she kept searching for a sign of life in him. He couldn't be dead. She couldn't have killed him. Her throat closed, her heart a timid thing in her chest, as her ears rang and she tried to comprehend what was happening. She couldn't have lost him. Her animal side cried out and she bellowed in response, unleashing all of her pain in the call. Her knees gave out, but she didn't feel the impact with the tarmac as she fought the need to change and run wild. The need to kill. It was too strong. She clutched at herself, afraid she wouldn't be able to hold her form, would succumb to the raw emotions running through her, rousing her primal instincts. The pain of losing Harbin was too great, though, too powerful for her snow leopard side to handle. It fought for control, and she wanted to give in to it, wanted the oblivion she knew awaited her if she allowed it to overwhelm her. She wouldn't remember the things she did, would no longer feel as she was now, hurting so deeply she couldn't breathe. Her more human mind would be subdued by her animal one, and she would be free. Fur swept up her bare legs. A dark-haired male appeared in the alley, morphing out of the shadows, his black robes allowing him to blend into the night, and his red eyes cold despite the fire that burned in them, as he looked down at Harbin and then at her. The urge to shift in order to escape her pain became an urge to shift in order to protect herself from this male. The witch. The tinny scent of magic was all over him, more potent now, as if he had grown stronger since their last meeting. She bared her fangs at him and rose onto her feet, quickly taking a few steps back to her clothes. She put her jeans on not to cover herself from his prying eyes, but to restore some control over her animal side, hindering it with the tight clothing. It wanted her to shift and fight, viewed the witch as a threat to her mate, one she had to eliminate in order to protect him. The male's red eyes edged towards his left. Aya looked there. A woman wrapped in a thick black ankle-length coat, the hood up to throw her face into shadow, walked out of thin air, as if she had teleported, or perhaps she had been cloaked by the male. The female pushed the hood back with gloved hands, revealing a spill of golden hair highlighted with silver, and a face Aya would never forget. The huntress. She might have been there when Aya had last fought the male, the time when Harbin had intervened. They could have ended this back then if only they had been aware that the woman traveled with the witch, shielded from view by magic. Aya, the huntress said, a soft smile playing on her lips that didn't fool Aya. She wasn't about to let her guard down and let the woman play her all over again. Her smile widened, causing crow's feet beside her green eyes. Time hadn't been kind to the huntress, the 17 years since they had last seen each other taking their toll on the mortal. I'm glad to see he didn't hurt you. The huntress looked down at Harbin where he lay on the ground between them, sprawled out and hopefully only unconscious. Not dead. Please don't be dead. Aya looked down at him again, monitoring him with her senses, searching for a sign of life. The huntress stepped closer to him, triggering a fierce need in Aya, an urge to place herself between him and the woman and protect him. She struggled to tamp down that need and stay where she was, sure that she would only place Harbin in danger if she moved to shield him. She would give away the game they were playing, a trap that had been set, and she was ready to spring. She had to stay where she was and keep her head, no matter what the huntress said or did. It all came down to this moment. The woman eyed Harbin, a glimmer of sick satisfaction in her eyes. 2 decades. I've spent 2 decades living in the shadows, fearing for my life. But now I'm free. The huntress raised her gaze away from Harbin and pinned it on Aya. Can you imagine what that was like? She whispered, her voice thick with emotion that emanated from her in tangible waves. She looked down at her hands before wrapping her arms around herself, her fingers pressing into her arms through her thick black coat. Slaughtering my friends, killing everyone I knew. All of us lived in fear, and my own fear grew worse with each letter or phone call I received that told me another was dead. 10 years ago, the last call came. I was alone, the sole survivor. Aya had to bite her tongue to stop herself from saying the woman had brought it all on herself. She might have suffered, but her pain was nothing compared with what Harbin had been through, or what Aya had been through. Aya couldn't find a single shred of sympathy for the bitch who had used him and had killed so many of her kin, and had subjected her and others to torturous experiments. She schooled her features, hiding her rising anger from the woman and the witch, afraid that the male would sense it in her if she didn't master her emotions and keep her head. She couldn't screw things up now, when they were so close.
I went into hiding out in the countryside, never leaving my home, afraid he would kill me if I set foot outside it.
The woman looked down at Harbin and sneered, her face twisting into darkness.
I couldn't continue living that way, so I looked for assistance in securing my freedom. I wanted to live my life again, and now I can.
The male beside the woman smirked, his red eyes glowing in the low light. There was an air of brimstone about him that was familiar now Aya had been to hell. He must have come from that dark realm, bringing with him information about Harbin that the woman had used to her advantage. She had taken out a contract on Aya, offering it to Harbin's guild, knowing he would take it and would expose himself, giving her an opportunity to kill him. The huntress crouched beside Harbin, her green eyes fixed on him, a strange somber edge to her expression as she studied him.
I had wanted the kill. I had wanted to deal with him as I should have back then.
Her voice turned distant, as if her memories had taken hold of her and she was reliving them.
I had been too soft, charmed by him, a foolish young woman who had allowed her emotions to get the better of her.
She lifted her head and looked over Harbin to Aya.
You know how that feels, though, don't you?
The cold edge to her green eyes chilled Aya and rang warning bells in her head, her heart screaming that the woman was on to her and knew this was a trap, that any moment now the witch would attack her or Harbin when he was vulnerable. Aya glared down at Harbin.
I was an idiot once. Like so many other females, I fell under his spell, and he betrayed me.
The huntress smiled and then sighed as she looked back down at Harbin.
We both fell under his spell, and we have both regretted it ever since. I should have remained detached and professional. But I failed. I couldn't bring myself to kill him after drugging him. He had been so handsome. He still is handsome. But I suppose that is a weapon he employs to slay many women.
Aya wanted to growl, not just because the huntress clearly still harbored desire for Harbin even though he wanted to kill her. She wanted to growl because the female clearly intended to finish the mission she had been given 20 years ago by ensuring Harbin was dead. That fear became a reality as the woman stood and held her hand out to the male beside her. He muttered something in a strange tongue, and a blade appeared in the woman's gloved hand.
It must have felt nice,
the huntress said in a soft voice. Her eyes locked on Harbin as she lowered the blade to her side, and then lifting to fix on Aya.
I want to know, since my victory is a hollow one, how does it feel to have killed the person who brought harm to you and your kin?
Aya's lips curled into a slow smile.
I'll tell you when you're drawing your last breath.
Chapter 21.
I'll tell you when you're drawing your last breath.
That was Harbin's cue. He flipped onto his feet and whirled to face the witch and the huntress, bringing his leg around in a fast blur at the same time. His bare heel connected with the right forearm of the male as he quickly brought his arm up to defend himself. Fire flashed in the witch's red eyes, and his left hand shot towards Harbin's ankle. Harbin was too fast, shifting his leg beyond the male's reach before he could snag it, and bringing his other leg up as he dipped his upper body downwards to counter his weight as he took another shot at the witch. This time, when the black-haired male blocked, he put a pulse of power into it, and Harbin went spinning across the alley, tumbling head over heels until he crashed into the wall and slid down it. Aya roared and kicked off, and his head snapped towards her. Her gold-silver eyes were locked on the blonde huntress, her emerging fangs bared on a wicked snarl as she ran at her. His focus leaped to the huntress, and the darkness he expected to rise and overwhelm him as it did whenever he crossed paths with a member of Archangel didn't come. Instead, calm rushed through him, clarity that filled him with a sense that he could fight and keep his head throughout the battle, and he knew it was because of Aya. Her presence soothed him, tempering the darkness and his memories. holding them at bay. His eyes darted to her, and every male instinct he possessed said to intervene and protect his mate. But he had a problem. He slid his silver gaze back to the witch that stood between him and the fighting females. The male neatened his snug black robe, smoothing the looser tails over his black trousers, and calmly lifted red eyes towards him. The emptiness in them warned Harbin that this wasn't going to be an easy fight, because the witch was already drawing immense power from the well of magic inside him, giving himself over to it and preparing himself for the coming battle. Harbin had watched the bastard fight before and knew some of his moves, but he wasn't going to let his guard down and think they were the only ones the male had in his arsenal. He wasn't going to take his eyes off the witch until he was down for the count. Only then could he go after the huntress. If he attempted an attack on her now, the witch would use that opening against him, and he would be the one down for the count instead. He had to trust that Aya could keep the huntress occupied until he had dealt with the witch. They had dealt with the witch. A familiar ripple of power ran down Harbin's spine, and he picked himself up, not taking his eyes off the witch as his backup arrived. Something soft hit him in the back. "At least have a little modesty." His lips quirked at the sound of disgust mixed with disappointment in Hart's voice. It wasn't the first time his boss had come armed with more than weapons, aware that Harbin was going to be naked when he arrived. It wasn't the 1,000th time. Hart had started to sound unimpressed after the 10th, and Harbin was never growing tired of hearing the elf say the same damn thing to him each time he brought him something to wear. He stepped backwards over the pair of black shorts, kicked them up and caught them, all without taking his eyes off the male witch. Aya grunted as she tackled the huntress, knocking the female back a few steps into view beyond the male. Harbin casually tugged the shorts on, but there was nothing calm about him. He was buzzing with a need to plow through the witch to reach the huntress and finally have his vengeance. He couldn't risk it, though. He had already placed Aya in enough danger by making her play bait. He wasn't going to turn the witch's focus towards her when she was having enough trouble dealing with the huntress. The bitch had drawn a small, compact crossbow and was firing it like the bolts were going out of style. Several zipped past him, and one shot towards the two males at his back. Fury's growl was nothing short of vicious as he caught and snapped one of the small metal bolts in half. The witch's red eyes shifted to the elf and narrowed, a flicker of recognition drawing in them. Harbin waited, aware that things were about to take a turn for the worse. The male's face twisted into dark lines, and his red eyes brightened, and the scent of magic in the air grew stronger, gaining a sickly edge to it that had him wanting to back away and find some clean air to breathe. Death. His eyes widened as the air shimmered between him and the witch, shifting like a heat haze at first, before shadowy figures grew in the center of the ripples, taking form and becoming solid as the male muttered beneath his breath. Clones. Their milky blue eyes glowed eerily in the low-lit alley. 3-on-3 didn't sound too bad, although it did give the witch the upper hand. Harbin's stomach dropped. Fuck. The two clones stepped aside, breaking apart and revealing another two. 5-on-3 didn't sound so good. The huntress shrieked and Harbin looked there, his eyes landing on her retreating back as she sprinted into the shadows, clutching her right arm. Aya went after her. Harbin took a step forwards, driven to follow his mate and the female. All hell broke loose. The clone on the left attacked him, swiping his hand through the air, long sharp nails aimed straight for Harbin's throat. Harbin leaped back at the last second, barely dodging the strike, and ignored Hart's unimpressed muttering. He held his right hand out to his boss and looked back at him as they edged in unison away from the clones and the witch, gaining some space. Hart brought his left hand up in front of him, and Harbin's twin short-curved black blades appeared in them. They were his, but he had left Hart as their owner, aware that the elf could only teleport items that belonged to him. It was handy at a time like this when they were working together or Harbin had to call on him for assistance, meaning the elf didn't need to leave his side to bring Harbin's blades to him. Fury remained in the space between them and the witch. He stared at the clones, his black eyes cold and emotionless, not showing the hunger that Harbin could feel in him. The excitement. The elf's ears grew pointed, flaring back against the tied top half of his overlong blue-black hair. The silver clasp that held it in place flashed under the street lamps as Fury launched forwards, and the golden light chased over the black scales of his skin-tight armor. His long black katana twitched at his side, skillfully shifted into an attack position, the point facing his enemies and both hands gripping the hilt. He growled and leaped, swung hard, and grinned as he came down on top of the clone on the far right. The clone tried to dodge but wasn't quick enough, and Fury's booted feet hit him hard in the chest, sending him crashing onto the tarmac. Fury kicked off, somersaulted in the air, and landed in a silent crouch behind the witch. Harbin huffed. It was typical of Fury to place a claim on the most powerful enemy present, although in this case it did leave 2 clones for him and 2 for Hart, which was more of an even split than Fury normally managed. Harbin was surprised he hadn't attempted to take on all 5 at once. It seemed that the mad bastard still had a shred of sense left in his twisted head after all, and knew he wouldn't be able to tackle both the witch and his copies alone. Divide and conquer. Harbin tossed one blade into his left hand, curled his fingers around the black leather hilts, and assessed the 2 clones on his side. He had to end this quickly. Killing the copies would weaken the witch, and give him the chance to deal the final blow so he could go after Aya. She was growing distant, still chasing the huntress. He couldn't sense any pain in her, but the connection was becoming hazy as she moved away from him. If she moved much further away, she could be hurt without him sensing it. He might not reach her in time to protect her. His gaze strayed to the direction she had run. Every fiber of his being said to forget the witch and go after his mate and the huntress. "Go!" Hart barked as he lashed out with his black blade at one of the clones, forcing the male to quickly strafe right to avoid the blow, opening a gap in their defensive line. Harbin glanced at his boss, caught the steely determination flashing in his violet eyes as he clashed with the clone again, and didn't hesitate. He ran for the opening Hart had created for him. Another clone stepped into his path, and he growled as he slashed with his twin blades, cutting through the air in vicious arcs. The male raised his arm to block, deflecting Harbin's left blade, but leaving himself wide open for his right one. He grinned as it sliced down the male's chest, leaving a gash in his black tunic, revealing a strip of white flesh and crimson. The clone grunted, his pale blue eyes wide and dark with pain as he stumbled backwards and brought his arms up to his chest. Hart snarled as he thrust his blade forwards, a violent blur in the low-lit alley, and the copy he had been fighting cried out. Harbin glanced his way as the male staggered into view, the end of Hart's black sword protruding from his back and his hands clutching the blade in front of him. Harbin's eyes widened as the clone gritted his teeth and pushed the blade out of him despite Hart's attempts to drive it deeper, forcing the elf back. They were growing stronger. He whipped his head around towards Fury and the male witch where they fought, 2 wraiths illuminated only by the violent flashes of colorful light, as the witch employed spells to weaken Fury. But he was weakening too. Each spell he cast drained his magic. Each injury they dealt his clones weakened him too. He was trying to keep them alive, pouring more strength into them. He was desperate. Harbin thought that only made him more dangerous. He whirled on his heel, bringing his right blade up at the same time. It connected with the neck of the clone Hart had been fighting, and he drove through the obstruction, growling as his blade sliced deep through bone and flesh. Blood sprayed, slapping onto the tarmac, followed by the dull thud of the clone's head as it dropped and the slam of his body that fell after it. The male witch barked out a feral roar as he hurled his right hand forwards, unleashing a blast of green light that hit Fury square in the chest and sent him flying across the alley. The elf smacked into a brick wall with such force that the blocks fractured, fault lines splintering outwards from where he had impacted. He grunted and dropped to the ground, motionless. "Fury!" Hart breathed, and silvery light flashed over him, almost blinding in the darkness. He reappeared next to his comrade in a crouch, his blade held horizontal in front of him and Fury, sharp edge facing the enemy. He kept his eyes locked on the witch as he ran his free hand over Fury's neck, searching for a pulse. The brief spark of relief in Hart's violet eyes before they suddenly darkened was all Harbin needed to tell him that Fury was fine. Hart slowly rose onto his feet, coming to face the male witch. Harbin ducked beneath a blow one of the remaining clones aimed at him, his heart pounding faster as he tried to keep all three of them with him. They needed to buy some time, giving Fury a chance to come around, and Harbin couldn't let any of the clones turn their focus on Hart. The elf couldn't fight the male witch and protect Fury from the clones at the same time. Harbin growled as fiery pain shot across his side and turned on his heel, swiftly facing the one who had attacked him. He lashed out with his right blade, forcing the male to block, and drove forwards with his left. The clone snatched his left wrist and twisted it. Harbin gritted his teeth and grunted as pain bolted through his bones and turned his body with his arm, stopping the male from breaking it. It seemed the less clones there were, the stronger the remaining ones became. Not a problem. He just had to move faster, not allowing them to land any attacks or see his moves coming. He flipped his right blade in his hand and slashed at the clone's head. The male's blue eyes shot towards his hand and he tried to dodge it, but he wasn't quick enough to completely evade the strike. Harbin's blade swiped across his cheek, and rivulets of red streamed down his jaw. The clone shoved with the hand that still held Harbin's wrist, sending him staggering backwards, giving him the space he needed. He couldn't shift because the witch would force him to change back, just as he had Aya, and it would weaken him. He was slower in his human form, but still as agile as and even more dangerous than he was in his snow leopard form. He flipped his other blade in his left hand, so the black knife ran along the underside of his forearm, his thumbs near the end of the hilts, and sprang at the clone. The male blocked, his forearms and fists knocking against Harbin's with each blow he tried to land. It seemed the witch was on to him, making his clones more agile. Silver short blades that matched Harbin's appeared in the hands of the clones around him. The witch was trying to gain the upper hand, arming his slaves with the abilities and weapons they needed to take him down. If he had been alone, it might have proven a problem. But he wasn't. A black snarl sounded from behind Harbin. Words growled in the elf tongue, and a dark wave rolled over him, malevolence in its purest form. It seemed to suck what little light there was from the alley and all the warmth from the air. The hairs on the back of Harbin's neck prickled, and his eyes widened as he spun to face the clone, saw the flash of a silver blade in his hand, and realized he wouldn't be quick enough to block the blow aimed straight at his neck. His heart lodged in his throat, and he swiftly brought his blade up, even when he knew he wouldn't make it. Black, jagged smoke exploded behind the copy, and blood sprayed over Harbin, drenching his bare chest. He stared blankly at the black-clawed hand protruding from the clone's chest, dripping with dark liquid, and then beyond the male to the one who towered behind him, a vision of grim death. Fury's lips peeled back in a grin, flashing enormous fangs, and the corona of violet shining around his pupils stuttered, beginning to fade. A chill went through Harbin as that ring of dying light changed shape, stretching into points at the top and bottom. His pupils were turning elliptical. "Fury!" Harbin barked, dropped one of his blades, and dragged the clone away from him, shoving the body to one side so he could reach the elf. "Fury, listen to my voice. Stay with me, buddy." Fury bared his fangs on a snarl that chilled Harbin's blood. The remaining violet in his eyes burned crimson. Hart muttered a ripe curse and appeared in a flash of silvery light between Harbin and Fury. He swung his left hand, his palm striking Fury's cheek so hard that the crack of flesh hitting flesh rang around the alley. "Pull yourself together!" Hart growled and Fury blinked, and Harbin could only stare as the red in his eyes faded, the violet shining through again. Hart grabbed the elf and pulled him into an embrace. "Fucking hell! I thought we'd lost you that time." Fury mumbled something in the elf tongue and pushed away from Hart, an awkward edge to his expression as he called his blade back to his hand and looked down at his boots. "Pull back," Hart said, but Fury ignored him, shifting into a warrior's stance as his dark eyes danced between the two remaining clones. He turned to face the witch, grinned, disappeared. Fucking hell. Harbin had never seen Fury actually complete a teleport, and it had happened twice now. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but the concerned look on Hart's face said it was bad. "Get him out of here!" Harbin barked and lashed out at one of the clones, driving it away from its remaining companion so he could fight it one-on-one. "Not going to happen." Hart's voice was a dark growl as he teleported and appeared behind the other copy, his blade a black blur as he slashed up the male's back. The clone gave an agonized bellow and swung with his silver knife as he turned on his heel to face Hart. The elf blocked with his sword, following through and knocking the clone back. His violet gaze leaped to fury where he battled the witch, a menacing shadow that Harbin couldn't track as he dodged each spell the male cast. I have to let him finish this, or he'll lose control again. Closure. Hart had warned him once not to get between Fury and an enemy, because Fury would kill anyone who got in his way once he had locked onto a target. He wouldn't let anyone steal that kill from him. He always finished what he started. Harbin could understand that. He looked towards the end of the alley again as he blocked another attack, his senses stretching outwards, scouring the city for Aya. She had gone after the huntress alone. She intended to take the bitch down, but he couldn't let her do it. He needed the closure. Go! Hart barked again, and Harbin kicked the clone away from him, sending it slamming into the wall. He looked back at his boss, saw the determination in his eyes, and that it was an order this time, one he would be an idiot to disobey. We can handle this. Hart brought his blade down in a swift arc, slashing down the clone's chest and sending him to his knees. The witch howled in pain and threw his hand out in the direction of the injured clone, pouring more magic into it. He was healing them on the fly, trying to keep the remaining two alive, but each time he used a spell on them, he weakened himself and left himself open. Fury attacked in that moment, raking claws over the witch's extended arm and slicing through his black robe. Blood spilled, the scent of it rank, tinny, and sharp, laced with death. Fury grinned. The witch turned on him, hitting him with another blast of magic, sending him crashing and tumbling across the tarmac. The second he stopped rolling, he was on his feet and springing at the witch, clashing with him again. Go! Hart said, and Harbin obeyed, certain that his two comrades could handle the witch and the two remaining clones. They were powerful elves, and he believed in them, knew in his heart that they would win. Aya needed him more than they did. He roared, the sound echoing around the dark streets, and kicked off, his blood pounding with a need to reach her. He focused wholly on her as he ran, aware that she would sense him coming towards her. Hold on, Aya, he whispered, praying to whatever gods would listen to him that they would protect his mate until he reached her, watching over her and keeping her safe for him. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't lose someone he loved again. Chapter 22. Harbin sprinted through the city streets, following his nose and the buzzing inside him that warned she was nearby. It grew stronger the closer he came to her, running barefoot and bare-chested along quiet residential roads surrounded by elegant townhouses. Something unsettling also grew with it, an echo of her pain in his side, his arm, and his thigh. The huntress had injured her. He banked left at a square and then backtracked when a sharp grunt sounded in the leafy area in the center of it to his right. Aya. He growled and ran in that direction. When he reached the wrought iron fence that surrounded the small park, the scent of blood hit him hard. Not just mortal blood, Aya's blood too. His heart hammered against his chest and he vaulted the fence, landing in a crouch on the leaf litter on the other side. He ran through the barrier of trees and out onto the cool, dewy grass. Aya slammed hard into the blonde huntress, knocking her back before flipping away from her, growling and snarling through her fangs as she fought for space. His heart almost stopped when he saw the blood coating her right thigh, slick on her jeans, and the slash across the left sleeve of her dark jumper over her biceps. Both looked as if they had been done with a blade. He readied his remaining one, wishing he'd had enough sense to grab the one he had dropped before rushing off to find Aya. He had been consumed by a need to reach her side again, though, and that need still rolled through him, commanding him to protect her from the huntress that had brought both of them so much pain. Moonlight bathed the park in somber hues, stealing the color from the world. It brightened as his animal side rose to the fore, his vision sharpening together with his senses, until he could detect every twitch in the huntress's body, could almost see her moves before she made them. The blonde female attacked, a frantic and wild thing as she lunged with the knife she tightly clutched in her left hand, and fired bolts from the compact crossbow in her right at the same time. Aya backflipped and kicked right the moment she landed, hurling herself out of the path of one of the bolts. It exploded on impact, showering earth upwards, filling the air with its rich scent. The huntress aimed the bow at her again as she recovered from the shockwave from the blast. Harbin roared and hurled himself at the huntress, catching her attention and distracting her, buying Aya time to find her feet. He brought his right leg up hard, smashing it into the female's arm and sending the crossbow flying from her hand. A pained cry cut through the still night air, and the huntress stumbled away from him, readying her blade at the same time as she brought her other arm to her chest. He flipped his knife in his hand and circled around her, forcing her away from Aya, and placing himself between the two females, shielding his mate. Aya's agitation flowed through him, and he knew it was because he had shown up. She wanted the kill, craved vengeance too, but he couldn't let her have it. He needed it more. He drew down a deep breath and prepared himself. The huntress eyed him and then Aya, and then looked beyond them both, doubt surfacing in her green eyes. 20 years, he growled and narrowed his gaze on her, drawing her focus back to him. 20 goddamned years I hunted you, and now I have you. Now you die. She surprised him by laughing.
No, now you die.
He doubted that. She lunged at him, and he strafed left to dodge her wild thrust and swung his fist at her. She ducked back, but his blow glanced off her cheek, sending her stumbling to one side and fighting for balance. He pressed his advantage, lashing out with his black blade. The huntress brought hers up, managing to block his attack, and shoved forwards. Hoping to throw him off balance too? That attack might have worked on Aya, but it wouldn't work on him, and the huntress knew it. He was stronger than his mate, and that was before he had spent 2 decades training as an assassin and honing his skills. She didn't stand a chance against him now. He dropped low as she lunged again, sweeping his leg around at the same time and taking her ankles out with the kick. She hit the ground hard on her back and grunted. He brought his blade down fast, aiming for her chest, and she rolled away from him. His knife struck the grass and he growled as she rolled back, her blade a silver flash through the darkness. It sliced across his left arm, and the strong scent of his blood joined that of Aya's and the huntress's. He pulled his knife free from the dirt and swung at her, but she was already on her feet. Aya moved closer, and he growled over his shoulder at her, sending her a warning to keep back and not intervene. This was his fight. The huntress swiftly dodged each attack he made, edging towards the far end of the park. Her gaze darted off in the direction he had come from, the wild edge to her green eyes growing with each glance. Her heart sounded hard in his ears as he advanced on her, stalking towards her, his blade held down at his side. She brandished hers, holding it in front of her, and he smiled as it shook in her grip. She had realized that the witch wasn't coming to aid her. She was alone. His lips curled into a slow smile and he kicked off, his bare feet sinking into the soft ground as he lunged at her. She fumbled her block and cut across his right forearm, slicing deep into the muscle. He snarled as pain rolled through him, the fiery burn only driving him to fight harder, tugging at his primal instincts to defeat his prey and protect his female. His fangs emerged, canines sharpening into 4 deadly points that he wanted to sink into her throat. He slashed at her and she threw herself at him, hitting him hard in the chest and catching him off guard. He lost balance and fell with her, landing with her on top of him. She rammed her blade towards him, and he brought his arm up and blocked her. The silver knife plunged deep into his forearm, and he howled in agony, blinded by the pain, his blade falling from his grip. The huntress pulled her knife free of his flesh, and he launched a hand out at her, catching her around the neck. He grimaced as he tightened his hold on her, choking the life out of her as she stared down at him through wide eyes. The second she overcame her shock, she lashed out at him again, slashing across his chest with her blade, a frantic feral thing as she tried to escape his hold. He growled and caught her arm, twisted it and tried to make her drop the knife so he could grab it and end her with it. She used her free hand to take the blade from the one he grasped and lunged at him with it. A bark left her lips and she recoiled backwards, her right shoulder jerking hard. A bolt protruded from it. Harbin didn't hesitate. He grabbed the short arrow, yanked it free of her flesh, and plunged it deep into the center of her chest. Her cry cut short, her eyes enormous as the tension fled her body, and she dropped her head to look down at the crossbow bolt sticking out of her heart. She raised a hand to touch it, a frown flickering on her brow, and slumped onto the grass beside him. Harbin tipped his head back and looked at Aya where she stood just a few meters away, upside down in his vision, the crossbow still aimed at the huntress. Damn, she was a wonderful mate. He had never had a partner before, but he was glad that he had one now, because she had helped him find the closure he needed. They had found it together. He pushed the huntress off him and sat up, looked down at her and waited for it to sink in that it was over. He had finished the 20-year-long mission to avenge his kin. Warmth spread through him. He looked back over his shoulder at Aya, and the heat that had been spreading through him, the light that had been chasing back the shadows, turned icy and black. She rested on her side on the wet grass, her face ashen and eyes closed stained with dark patches that glinted in the moonlight. She was hurt worse than he had thought. His heart pounded as he pushed to his feet and rushed to her. His knees hit the dirt hard beside her, and he pulled her onto her back and into his arms. "Aya," he whispered and jostled her, fear closing his throat and burning through him, destroying the sane part of him that said she would be all right, and replacing it with poisonous words about her leaving him, dying. He couldn't lose her now. He looked her over and his heart plummeted as he saw all of the blood on her right thigh and her side, too. Her injuries were deep, and she had already lost a lot of blood. Her heart beat slowly, a timid thing that clawed at his sanity, feeding his fears. Her eyelids fluttered open as he smoothed his palm across her dirty cheek. "Is it over?" He nodded and cupped her cheek, his hand shaking against it. "It's done." She smiled faintly. "That's good." A frown danced on her brow and her smile faded. "You scared me." Harbin tried to smile for her, but it wobbled on his lips as the whispered words about losing her grew louder and he couldn't combat them. "I know. I had to pretend I was dead. You can shout at me if you want. Tell me how cruel it was to do that to you. Be mad at me, Aya." Anything to show him that there was still fight left in her. She was still strong enough to survive her wounds. His blood chilled as she sank deeper into his arms, and he jostled her again to keep her awake and with him. "It's a trick Hart taught me. Nothing more than a trick. But you're scaring me now, Aya." A smile fluttered on her lips and she opened them, as if she wanted to say something. No words left her lips as she slumped in his arms. Harbin growled and tried to rouse her again, but nothing he did worked. "I can't lose you, Aya," he whispered, and looked around the park, drawing deep breaths as he tried to clear his head, so he could think about what he needed to do to save her. Kavanaugh. He had to get her to Underworld. She would be safe there, able to sleep and heal in peace. He couldn't move her until he had bound her wounds, though. The air off to his left shimmered and Hart appeared with fury, both of them covered in blood that belonged to them. "The bastard got away," Hart growled and looked down at the dead huntress. "He disappeared. It must have been when she died. It broke his contract with her and he fled. I'm not sure we've seen the last of him, though." Hart's violet eyes swung towards Harbin and widened when they landed on Aya. "Is she all right?" He immediately crossed the narrowed strip of grass to Harbin and crouched beside her. Harbin held her closer, the conviction he felt inside him pouring out in his words as he looked down at her. "She will be. I'll see to that. I won't let anything bad happen to her." Because he would go insane if he lost her. She was his light, his everything, the sole reason he was alive. Without her, he had no reason to live. Without her, his primal side would consume him, and he wasn't sure he would come back from it this time. If the pain of losing her drove him into his snow leopard form, he wouldn't want to come back from it. He would lose himself in that wild oblivion, mourning his mate forever. Bandages appeared in Hart's hand, and the elf held them out to him. "We must take care of her wounds." Harbin nodded and pulled down a breath to steady himself and put a leash on his animal's side. He hadn't lost her yet. He wouldn't lose her. He set her down on the grass and focused on binding her wounds, stemming the flow of blood from the lacerations across her stomach and thigh, while Hart dealt with the cuts on her arm. His fingers slowly steadied as her heartbeat grew stronger, a comforting sound in his ears that he focused on as he took care of her. "I'll take her to Kavanaugh," he said, his voice distant as he worked. "I'll leave her in his hands. She'll be safe there. If the witch wants vengeance, he'll be after us, not her. I'll stay away until we know we're in the clear." Harbin's fingers paused on the bandage around her thigh. He wasn't sure he could leave her, though. He wasn't sure he was strong enough to do it, not when she was hurt. He needed to be by her side, but satisfying that need by remaining with her would only place her in more danger, and he had already put her through enough. Hart sat back on his heels and then gracefully rose onto his feet. "We shall split up then, but come home soon. You're safest at the guild. We can handle the witch if he shows up there." Harbin nodded. "I'll return soon." Hart was right, and the guild could handle the witch. He would be no match for the combined power of the assassins who called it home. "I don't have the strength left to teleport you both to Underworld, and I'm not sure it would go down well if I did anyway." Hart's violet eyes shimmered with something like remorse, and Harbin couldn't stop himself from wondering whether it was regret over not being able to help him, or regret over the elf female who lived at the club with her jaguar mate. He turned his cheek to Harbin, looking off to his right, and held his hand out. "Fury." The darker elf male shuffled closer to his companion, his head bent and lips moving silently as he muttered things in their language. Hart eyed him warily but with an edge of concern, and took hold of his arm. He bent his head to Harbin, and silvery light traced over both elves, and then they were gone and he was alone with Aya. Harbin stroked his fingers through her black hair and studied her pale face for a moment, his senses locked on her and monitoring her. She was stronger already, her body beginning to heal the wounds they had bound. He told himself that she would be fine now, but he couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. Until she opened her eyes and smiled at him, he wouldn't stop feeling as if he was going to lose her. Gods, when had she changed him so much? He scooped her up into his arms, pushed onto his feet, and started towards Underworld, cradling her carefully, not feeling the pain of his injuries as the ache in his heart eclipsed it. Aya. He had fallen so hard for her, so quickly that the drop had been a dizzying rush, and only now that he had landed was he coming to terms with what had happened. He was in love with her, and he wasn't sure he could live without her now, not as he had intended to barely a few days ago, wanting to have a brief moment with her before pushing her away. Now he wanted to pull her closer and never let her go. The walk to Underworld was over before he knew it, his feet carrying him towards his brother on autopilot, his keen senses able to track him across the city. The neon sign above the club was switched off, and the heavy dark metal doors were closed. The streets around the huge brick building quiet except for the distant hum of cars on the main roads nearby. He dragged his eyes away from the door, settling them on Aya, the weight on his chest growing heavier as he saw how pale she still was. This wasn't going to go well, and he was asking a lot from his brother when they had only just got back together. But this was the safest place for her right now. He had to do what was best for her. The journey to Hell and his home there would take too long, and traversing the portal between the two realms would drain her strength. She needed to rest and recover, and Kavanaugh and Eloise would make sure she did just that. He sucked down another sharp breath, quelled his desire to turn away from the door and take Aya with him back to Hell, and knocked instead. He stared down at her as he waited, losing himself in her, listening to her soft breathing and her steady heartbeat. She would be safe here with Kavanaugh and the others, away from him. The door creaked open and he lifted his head, instantly shifting his focus to the sandy-haired, bare-chested male on the other side. "Leave!" The jaguar shifter snapped, his golden eyes glowing dangerously, and then growled when Harbin shook his head. He jammed his hands into his black sweatpants and stared him down, radiating tension and fury that had Harbin's hackles rising. Kiter was pissed, and Harbin could understand why, because he would be upset too if someone made moves on his mate. But he wasn't going to let the shifter drive him away, at least not until he had agreed to take Aya inside. "I'll go. I don't want to cause trouble, but I need to see my brother." Harbin looked down at Aya and felt Kiter's gaze leave him, wanted to growl when he sensed that he was looking at Aya. "I need Kavanaugh to take care of her for me. She's hurt. I need her safe, and I need to tell my brother what I've done." Kiter snarled. "What did you do to her?" Harbin met his gaze and growled at him, baring his fangs, his animal side pushing at his control when he realized the shifter thought he had been the one to hurt her. "Nothing. She was injured in a battle. I can't take her with me to hell. She won't make the journey and she won't be safe there. I need her safe." Gods, he needed that, more than anything. His arms shook beneath her slender weight as he looked back down at her, vision blurring as that need pulsed through him, combining with his fears to strip him of his strength. "Is she your mate?" Kiter whispered softly, all anger gone from his voice. Harbin sensed his brother nearby, felt the familiar pierce of his gaze, and nodded. "She is my fated female." He lifted his head and looked past Kiter to Kavanaugh, where he stood shrouded in shadow behind him, his loose gray loungewear and silver hair making him stand out in the darkness. He caught the concern mixed with warmth in his bright silver eyes, happiness that Harbin wasn't sure he deserved. "You can stay," Kiter said, snatching his focus away from his brother and stoking the battle raging inside him, the war between leaving her and staying by her side. "Only until she's recovered, and if that elf shows up, I'll kill you both." Harbin didn't doubt that, and he couldn't blame Kiter for putting the threat out there either. Relief flitted across Kavanaugh's face, and he moved closer. Harbin looked from his brother to Kiter and then down at Aya. Gods, he wanted to stay with her, but in doing so he feared he would bring danger to the doorstep of Underworld. His heart whispered to stay, but it also told him to stick with his plan and go. He closed his eyes, lowered his head, and held Aya closer to him. Her weight in his arms was also the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, something he couldn't ignore. "I can't," he said, and opened his eyes and studied Aya's pale face, aching as he thought about leaving her and knew the time was drawing closer. He vowed that he would come back for her, because they had a lot to talk about, and he wasn't sure he could keep away from her for long. He wasn't sure he could live without seeing her face every second of every day, forever. He pressed a soft kiss to her brow, and then lifted his head and looked at the two males. "I won't place everyone here in danger." Kiter and Kavanaugh looked concerned again. "I've angered a witch, a very powerful one." It didn't seem to be explanation enough for his brother, because he stepped forwards and frowned at him. That same look Harbin had seen 1,000 times as a boy. He was in for an earful. "You're staying," Kavanaugh said, deep voice rumbling through the tense silence. "If Aya is your mate, she needs you here. You need to be here." "I need to be far from here," Harbin countered. "I brought her here so she would be safe. The Huntress." Kavanaugh paled. Harbin swallowed hard, and with a dry mouth and pounding heart said, "I've finally killed her. The last of the Archangel team who attacked the Pride. But she employed a witch to deal with me. We lost him, and he's dangerous. Aya will only be safe from the witch if I leave her here." Kiter huffed and folded his arms across his broad, bare chest. "There are wards on the building. One's cast by a powerful white witch. They're strong enough to keep anyone out who I don't want entering my club. Now I know of the witch, I'll just decide not to allow any witches in, and that will stop him." "It's true," Kavanaugh said. "Nothing can penetrate the barrier around the building, or sense who's inside it if Kiter doesn't want to let them in. So are you going to stay now?" Harbin was tempted because he couldn't bring himself to leave Aya's side when she was hurt. "Listen to your heart, because it's what you seem best at." Kavanaugh moved closer still, coming to stand beside Kiter. Your love for our family and kin drove you to go on a journey for revenge. And while that journey separated us for 2 decades, it has finally brought us back together, too. And it has brought you to your mate. You need to listen to your heart again now, because I suspect I know what it's telling you to do." Harbin sighed. It was telling him to stay with her now that he knew the building was protected and that everyone in it would be safe. He could lay low until the witch lost his scent and be with Aya, where he needed to be. He hadn't won her yet. If he left her now, he risked losing her. He looked at his brother and saw in his pale silver eyes that he wanted him to stay for another reason, too. He wanted to be a family again, and Harbin found himself wanting that too, even when he wasn't sure how to go about it, or how to overcome everything that had happened. It felt as if the past stood between them like a crevasse he couldn't cross to reach the side he wanted to stand on, the side where his brother stood. But if he did as Kavanaugh asked, maybe there was a chance he would find the right path to take to cross that ravine between them. Maybe staying would do more than merely reunite him with his brother. He looked down at Aya. Maybe it would forge a new family for him, one made up of his brother and Eloise, and his mate. Chapter 23. Aya slowly became aware of the world around her, the dark veil lifting to bring sounds to her ears and scents to her nose, and sensation to her body. She was in a room, one unfamiliar to her. It wasn't hell. The air held the familiar sooty smell of London, but she wasn't in her bed in her apartment. She was warm, cocooned in softness that she didn't want to leave, and that made it hard to care where she was, because it was so comfortable here. The soothing warmth wasn't the only reason she didn't want to move. Her body ached, sore in places, and as awareness of her surroundings finished dawning, awareness of what she had been through replaced it. She recalled the fight between her and the huntress, how desperate she had been to keep the female in her sights so Harbin wouldn't lose her again, and both of them could have the closure they needed. She remembered taking blows and dealing them, and remembered passing out after the battle had come to an end. The moment the huntress's heart had given its final beat, Aya's strength had left her, and she had collapsed. She recalled how afraid Harbin had looked when he had held her, and that drove her to open her eyes, because he was in the unfamiliar room with her, silently prowling around it. His emotions were in turmoil, a turbulent, tangled flow from him around her. He was worried about her. She needed to show him that she was recovering. The dull light in the room was bright as she lifted her eyelids, bouncing off the cream walls and stinging her eyes, and making her flinch away from it. Harbin instantly swung towards her, the dark shadows leaving his handsome face and striking eyes as he saw she was awake. The relief he felt coursed through her too, but concern quickly overwhelmed it in him. Aya ached with a need to alleviate his fears, but she wasn't sure what to say, not when her heart was tearing her in 2 different directions. It was over. The huntress was dead, and she wasn't sure what that meant. The part of her that had vowed to leave Harbin once that had happened warred with the part of her that wanted to stay. "You had me worried there for a while," he whispered hoarsely, and the ache in her chest intensified. She could finally see the affection in his eyes, love that the deepest part of her soul had wanted to see in them for a long time. All of his feelings were on show for her to see, none of them hidden behind a barrier, because he had let his guard down for her. Aya wanted to curse him, and she wanted to kiss him at the same time. The battle between her polar desires grew fiercer, cutting her deeper, right into her heart. "How long was I out?" She looked around her at the room as Harbin twisted the knob on the light switch near the white door, dimming the ceiling lamp and giving her eyes some relief as they slowly adjusted to her using them again. "It's only been a day." The way he said that made her feel it had felt longer than that short span of time to him. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her, and she looked him over. The black t-shirt stretched tight across his muscular back, tempting her eyes, but something else firmly held her attention. Bandages wrapped around his arms. How hurt was he? She wanted to ask, but he spoke again. "We're lying low at Underworld right now. I didn't manage to kill the witch." He looked away from her and she sensed his shame, wanted to touch his jeans-clad thigh and comfort him. She cursed him for tugging on her heartstrings instead, and doubly cursed the guilt that welled inside her when she realized why the witch had escaped. It was because she had run off after the huntress, and he had felt compelled to go after her, his primal instincts driving him to protect her.
"I'm sorry,"
she whispered. Harbin just smiled, and it was so strange to see it. He was changing, becoming more like the male she had known in her youth, becoming more dangerous, because this male was even more alluring than the one he had been back then, and even more alluring than the one he had become. He was a perfect blend of boyish charm and deadly assassin, intoxicating her and luring her back under his spell. "How do you feel?" He pressed his right hand into the mattress, twisting his body towards her, and ran a glance over her that had her body heating beneath the covers. She cursed him again. She was meant to be resting, her body still recovering, but she couldn't stop the flood of desire that swept through her whenever he looked at her like that, as if he would die if he didn't touch her soon. Gods, she might die too. She stifled that thought and focused, reminding herself that she was meant to be leaving him. Heck, just the thought of going through with it tore her to pieces inside, but she had to be strong.
"I'm feeling better, stronger."
She pushed the necessary words out.
"I can leave soon."
His face darkened. "Leave?" She averted her gaze to the pale blue covers, unable to look at him when she could feel hurt flowing through him, and she wanted to take it away. She had to be strong. She had to be. He was changing, and that meant he might leave his dangerous life as an assassin behind. And what then? Would he want children? The thought of building a life with him only for him to shatter it when he discovered she couldn't have children was too painful. She would rather cut her ties with him now. "I thought we had something." He stood sharply, and her gaze automatically leaped to his face. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He towered over her, his fierce silver gaze locked on her, demanding she answer him. Aya closed her eyes and lowered her face away from him, and thought about what he had said to her back in the Assassin's Guild in hell. She sighed.
"I'm the one who isn't right for you. I can't give you what you deserve."
His confusion ran through her, a powerful force that made her want to look at him and explain everything, partly in hope that he would understand and would still want her as his mate. She pushed her fears away, tamped down her weakness, and found the strength to look him in the eye, even when it made her heart pound like crazy and her palms sweat.
"I can't have children."
His soft smile threw her, and he left her reeling when he spoke, a chuckle in his wicked, deep voice. "That's because you're too young." She was the confused one now.
"Too young?"
Harbin sat beside her again, a sigh leaving him as his backside hit the mattress. His weight on it made her roll towards him, so her hip pressed against his back. "You're only 95. His smile held, and she could only stare at him in stunned silence as she realized he knew exactly how old she was. She couldn't believe that he knew such a thing about her. "You obviously weren't listening in class the day that we learned that while males all mature at a century, females vary in age. If you can't have kids, it's because you haven't matured yet. Who the hell told you such bullshit in the first place?" Aya wasn't sure what to say in response to that. The smile on his face turned wicked and teasing. "Were you too busy staring at me that day?" She frowned at him, but he didn't repent. He only grinned. "You were daydreaming about kissing me, weren't you? Fuck. I was certainly daydreaming about kissing you." Aya's cheeks burned before she could shut down the flush of heat that swept through her on hearing that. She had never realized that he had liked her that way before she had kissed him. He sighed and his expression turned somber, all of the light leaving it. "I wish you hadn't avoided me. I wish that things had been different." All of the light that had been building in her faded too, replaced by a weight of guilt she had never felt on her shoulders before. The attack on the village was partially her fault. She had rejected him, and he had responded by seeking out other females, landing him in the hands of the huntress. She pushed away from her thoughts, unwilling to let them cloud her heart and mind. There was no way to change what had happened, no matter how much both of them wanted there to be.
"It's ancient history now,"
she said, and he looked across at her, his silvery eyebrows furrowed into a look that made her want to touch his cheek and soothe his troubled soul.
"It's over."
"Over," he echoed, and seemed even more troubled, as if he thought she was applying that word to them, too. Was she? Did she really intend to leave him? She wasn't sure, but she was certain of one thing. She intended to escape this heavy conversation until she could get her head on straight. She searched for an escape route and found one when raucous laughter came from below. She looked to Harbin for an explanation. "Kavanaugh and Eloise are celebrating their mating with an official gathering," he said with a smile that warmed the cold parts of her heart, making her wish that smile was all for her.
"You should be there."
Aya nudged his right shoulder with her hand, jerking him forwards. He huffed and scowled at her, and then his face softened and he sighed as he looked at her. "I'd rather be here with you." Her heart skipped a beat. Damn him. Had he always been this irresistible and charming? She knew the answer to that question in her heart, a heart that was touched by his desire to remain close to her and take care of her. There was more to his reluctance to go down and join in the celebration than his need to be with her, though. He was nervous. He couldn't hide that from her, no matter how much he was clearly trying to conceal it with soft smiles and fussing over her.
"Have you spoken to Kavanaugh?"
she said. The look he gave her, a little guilty and shy, such a contrast to the dangerous male she had come to know, told her that he had been in the room with her the past day, hiding from his brother. She found that a little endearing, but at the same time she wanted to box his ears. This was his chance to heal things with his brother, and she wouldn't let him waste it, because she knew he would regret it.
"We could go down together. I'm sure Kavanaugh would like to see you, and we'll be happy to see I'm well, too."
Harbin shot down that suggestion with a dark scowl. "You're not strong enough yet." Unlike him, she was aware that the connection between them made it impossible for her to fool him, so she didn't bother to deny it.
"Just a little while. It's important."
She placed her hand on his knee and he looked down at it, his frown melting away and steely gaze softening.
"We can come back when I feel tired, but right now I feel fine."
He frowned again, that single shift in expression telling her that he didn't believe her, but also that he wasn't going to argue with her about it. He huffed and muttered something under his breath as he pushed onto his feet, trudged across the room and grabbed a stack of clothing off the wooden chest of drawers near the door. He carried them back to the bed and set them down next to her. Aya gasped as he tugged the covers back, her hands racing to cover herself. "No need to hide from me," he chuckled softly. "I did get you naked in the first place." Heat bloomed on her cheeks and he groaned and turned away, muttering more things she couldn't quite hear. Only this time she didn't need to hear the words to know what the problem was. She could sense his desires skyrocketing, the hunger that swept through him rushing through her too, awakening her need of him. Aya wrestled it back under control and dressed as quickly as she could. Each time one of her bandaged wounds ached and she hissed through her teeth in response, Harbin looked back at her, concern in his eyes before his cheeks darkened and he swiftly looked away again. She hadn't realized he could be such a gentleman. It was another thing to add to the one she was learning about him, and it made her want to tease him by intentionally drawing his gaze to her just so she could see that boyish blush on his cheeks. "You done yet?" he growled, disgruntled and snappy, and she stifled her giggle. She didn't think she would ever grow tired of teasing him. Her smile faltered. It hit her hard that she wanted to stay with him, that leaving him really wasn't an option and had never been, not even when she had thought she couldn't give him children. She closed the button on her pale blue jeans and smoothed the burgundy flowing top over them, her fingers shaking as she looked at Harbin's back and felt as if her future happiness rested on those wide shoulders of his. He was everything she wanted, everything she needed. She just wasn't sure how to tell him.
"Done."
Her voice was a bare whisper, but he heard her and turned around. The hunger that flooded his eyes, dilating his pupils and brightening his silver irises, made her feel as if she was wearing something sexy and revealing, rather than the slightly too tight blue jeans and a little too loose top. He stared at her for so long that her nerves got the better of her and she looked away from him. His soft sigh and his hand appearing in view drew her gaze back to him. He flexed his fingers, a silent command for her to take his hand, and she swallowed hard, feeling like an idiot as she stared at it. She had slept with him, had been more than a little wicked, but the thought of taking his hand made her nervous, made everything seem so much more real, because it made her feel that he had feelings for her, that he might be in love with her too. She slipped her hand into his, and it was warm, strong as he closed his fingers around hers and held them gently, as if he was afraid of hurting her. She stared at their joined hands as they left the room and walked down the corridor, her head spinning as she tried to find the words she needed to say to him, the ones that would convey how she felt about him and that she wasn't going to leave him after all. She was going to stay. They turned a corner on the metal staircase and she felt eyes on her. Aya looked at the gathering in front of her, stunned by the number of people crammed into the white-walled space, but moved to tears by the decorations. A shiver ran through her, unleashing her emotions as she took in the room. Candles glowed, dotted in groups around the space, their golden light warming the white walls that could have easily been the pale perfection of snow. Across the room, swags of colorful prayer flags hung from twisted ropes, adorned with gold scripts and patterns that she hadn't seen in what felt like forever. It transported her back to the Pride Village, to a time when she'd had a family and a place where she belonged, and celebrations such as this had been the highlight of her peaceful life. Harbin's hand tightened around hers, squeezing softly, and she looked up at him. His tender smile stole her breath, and she smiled shakily back at him when he brushed a tear from her cheek with the pat of his thumb. "Something in your eye," he whispered, and she nodded, glad he wasn't going to tease her over her reaction to seeing the traditional decorations, because it had moved him too. She could feel it in him as he looked down at her, their joined hands strengthening the connection between them, making it easier for her to sense his emotions and pull them apart to identify each one. Nerves still ran through him, and they only increased as his brother approached, cutting through the crowd in their direction, handsome in his colorful embroidered tunic. Kavanaugh beamed at her. "Are you better?" Harbin huffed. "Of course she isn't better." His brother's smile dropped and he frowned. "Then what is she doing out of bed?" Aya stepped forwards between the two brothers, not wanting them to get into an argument because of her.
"It's my fault. I wanted to see the celebration and congratulate you."
Harbin and Kavanaugh huffed at the same time, both wearing the same look on their faces, one that screamed how unimpressed they were. She released Harbin's hand and pressed both of hers to her hips, staring them down. They might have grown up in a world away from this one, a place where females knew to bow to the orders of the males, but they weren't in that world any longer. In this world, she was equal to them and able to make up her own mind about things. A soft giggle sounded from behind Kavanaugh, and Eloise stepped out, a sight for sore eyes that had Aya welling up again. She looked exactly as Aya remembered her, with her wavy chestnut hair spilling around her shoulders and her golden eyes bright with amusement, and was stunning in her tighter-than-traditional embroidered dress that bore depictions of mountains and snow leopards and the wild animals of their homeland.
"Ignore them. Boys will be boys."
Eloise held her hand out to her.
"We should get a drink."
Harbin snagged Aya's arm, holding her back. "I'll go with her." The way he eyed all of the males in the room made it clear that he wasn't just doing it to support her if she needed his assistance. He viewed the unmated males as a threat to her, his primal instincts telling him that the males would attempt to steal her from him. She took the steps down to the packed floor and hadn't made it another inch before Harbin had his arms slung around her, tucking her close to his front. He growled at several males as they slowly crossed the room to the buffet table against the far wall, and played havoc with her at the same time. The feel of his powerful body pressing against her back, shifting deliciously with each step, stirred naughty thoughts, making her feel a little lightheaded. She breathed a sigh of relief when they reached the other side and he released her, seized her arms, and glared at her. "Wait right here," he muttered, his tone dark and dangerous, warning her not to move an inch. She caught Eloise's smile as he stalked away from them and couldn't stop her own from coming out.
"They can be a little overbearing,"
Eloise said, her soft voice light and teasing.
"It's so good to see you again. Harbin told us what had happened to you. Gods. I'm so sorry, Aya."
Aya shrugged it off, not wanting to think about the past.
"It's over now."
Her gaze tracked Harbin as he prowled the buffet table, her smile widening as he kept piling things onto the already full plate. He lingered longest near the sweet things, picking lots of treats that looked delicious. He had come out with her exact age, and now he was choosing her favorite foods. Just how well did he know her? As well as she knew him? Maybe they really had been made for each other. He worked his way back towards her, his face a picture of determination, as if he had been issued a mission and refused to fail. He always had been headstrong. She only hoped he would be like that about their bond, telling her straight that he wanted it to happen and not letting her lose her nerve. Eloise said something, and she was so busy smiling at Harbin, thinking about the future they might have together, that she missed it and had to drag her eyes away from him to blankly look at her.
"Sorry,"
she said. The brunette female smiled.
"Maybe this is a joint celebration."
Aya frowned, still sure she had missed something. Eloise pointed to her neck. She touched the back of it, and Harbin went pale, the plate of food falling from his hand to smash at his feet, scattering its contents across the floor and drawing everyone's attention to him. Her eyes widened and her ears rang as silence descended, all thought and feeling fleeing her as she fingered the scabs. Maybe there had been another reason he hadn't wanted her to leave the room. The scab marks on the back of her neck were thick, and her fingers trembled as she found 4 of them. Her mouth turned dry and shivers ran through her, and her eyes sought Harbin's. The look in them confirmed he was already aware of it. The bite was deeper than she had thought. Not a mere scratch at all. His eyes were as wide as hers, and she could feel he was waiting for her to say something. She couldn't find the words, not when her mind was reeling, her heart hammering against her chest as the reality of what she was feeling on her neck slowly crashed over her. They were already mated. Harbin walked straight through the fallen food, the scattered pieces of the china plate shattering further under his boots, and didn't stop until he was right in front of her, his heat curling around her and his scent invading her senses. His eyes darted between hers as she tipped her head back to look up at him. "I am sorry." Those 3 words weren't the ones she had needed to hear, the ones she wanted him to say to her as the world came tumbling down around her. It only grew worse when he kept going, rambling on, words she failed to take in until she sensed the growing distress in him and heard him say, "There might be a way to undo it." That hurled her back into the room, threw her fears and her hurt out of the window as it narrowed her focus down to him and the tremendous pain she could sense in him. Aya pressed her finger to his lips to silence him, not wanting him to hurt himself further when he was already hurting enough.
"Why would I want to undo it?"
she whispered, her eyes locked on his, her feelings steady and constant, there for him to sense if he went looking. "I'm really not good enough for you. I'm not what you need," he croaked, and her finger trembled against his lips, her heart going out to him as he stood before her, stripped of his strength, left bare and vulnerable, waiting for her to hurt him. She didn't want to harm him or break his heart or whatever he thought she was going to do. She wanted to hold him close and never let him go. She knew that he viewed his profession and his past as a barrier between them, but to her it was nothing. The moment she had fallen in love with him, she had accepted everything about him, including his life as an assassin, and that his main pride was now a guild in hell.
"No,"
she said. His face went slack and pain rolled through him, shining in his striking eyes. Aya shifted her hand to his cheek, cupping it as she stared deep into his eyes, and whispered to him, putting every drop of her love into her words so he would hear it.
You're what I want.
She moved closer, pressing her front against his, and cupped his other cheek, holding his face as he exhaled hard. She tiptoed and brought his head down to her at the same time, and breathed against his lips.
You're what I've always wanted.
He growled and wrapped his arms around her, gathering her close as he kissed her, a frantic outpouring of love that spoke to her soul and told her the words that he had failed to find too, the ones that seemed so elusive and frightening. His strong arms crushed her against him, and she knew he would never let her go. They would never part again. She jerked when Kavanaugh slapped Harbin on the back and laughed as everyone closed in, congratulating them. She couldn't take her eyes off Harbin as he smiled, his eyes bright with it, shining with the happiness she could feel in him, happiness she had given to him. They had walked dark paths, had survived terrible times, but fate had made those paths cross again, and now they would be together forever. They had a pride and a family again. They had each other. Harbin pulled her back into his arms and kissed her so sweetly that she melted into him, lost in his kiss and his love for her. She struggled for the words, filled with a need to tell him, even though she was sure he would feel it in her kiss too. He pressed his cheek to hers, his breath warm on her neck, teasing her and making her shiver, and she opened her mouth, the words on the tip of her tongue. He stole her voice from her as he whispered in the old language of their species, telling her in the most beautiful and traditional way of their kind. I love you, Aya. Tears stung her eyes, but she smiled as he kissed her again, her heart filled to bursting as she nestled close to him. She pressed her hands to his chest, broke the kiss, and whispered against his lips.
I love you too, Harbin.
He growled and kissed her again, his love surrounding her and flowing through her, mingling with hers. The love that they shared as fated mates, bonded forever. A love that would always grow stronger. A love that was eternal. The end.